Hi, everybody. I have my good friend Will Spencer back on my channel today. If you don't know Will, he was on my channel not too long ago to talk about, in my opinion, one of the most important topics of last year, which is about the woke right. Be sure to check it out. I will leave a link in the description for you to check that out if you'd like to. But we hinted in that video about having Will back on my channel to talk about his testimony, because that's a whole other video, a whole different story, which is what today's video is. Will, thank you so much for coming back on my channel today.
Thanks so much for having me back, Melissa. I've been looking forward to this.
Yeah, it's an honor to have you back on. Let's go ahead and just jump right into it. So your background is in the New Age, but your story is very unusual. Even I don't know the layers that go into this story. Why don't you start from the beginning?
Yeah, so it's a story that spans about 30 years to tell, and I've been actually been thinking a lot about it, and I've been discovering new layers of my own story as I've been looking into it, which has been very interesting. So it starts in what might seem an unusual place, but is actually quite common. I grew up in a Jewish family. My family was Reform Jews, so largely secular, but we were very ritualistic. So we would do Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, and Yom Kippur, Day of Atonement services every year. We would celebrate Passover in Hebrew, and we would light candles on Hanukkah, no Christmas. And I was bar mitzvahed when I was 13. In fact, my Torah portion was the 10 Commandments. And all that kind of kept going until I was around 13 years old when my grandfather, my mom's dad, passed away. But that was a big part of my life growing up, was an introduction to the concept of God, the idea of God, and our obligations to him, but no real discussion of who God was. So I think a lot of it was, like I said, it was very ritualistic, but it wasn't like we would sit around reading the Old Testament. We never read the Psalms or Proverbs. Like, of course, I knew the Exodus story. Everyone knows the Exodus story, but we never read any of the prophets or anything like that. But it sort of began there with the idea of God, but not really much discussion of him. And I think I remember the first time I ever remember thinking about some of these subjects was I was studying for my bar mitzvah, and I was sitting in the office with the rabbi as he's walking me through, my Torah portion, which again was the 10 Commandments. And I remember him saying something like, this is 12-year-old me. I remember him saying something like, the second 5 commandments are there so you don't violate the first 5 commandments. And I remember sitting there, I was like, that's interesting. Just like really being struck kind of by that thought that there was like this deeper logic and meaning to it. And so I think that was probably the first time I can remember really starting to think in sort of theological directions, even if it didn't characterize my life in the way that it would later.
Okay, so you grew up in a Jewish household. It was secular, right?
Yeah.
It's very typical of a lot of Jewish families in America.
Yes, very much so. Very much so. And it's actually quite typical that a lot of Jews grow up in the United States and in the West and are aware of their Jewish heritage, but aren't given the spiritual aspect of it and go looking for it elsewhere. That's very, very common. In fact, I recently read a book called Lord of the Air by a man named Tal Brook, who passed away maybe a decade or so ago. And the book was talking about his experiences in India in the mid-1960s under the tutelage of Sai Baba. So Tal Brook became Sai Baba's top Western disciple. And in the book, Brooke reveals later he becomes a Christian. It's kind of spoiler alert, I guess. He becomes a Christian that he reveals that a lot of Sai Baba's followers were Jewish. And so it seems quite odd to think that why are so many Jews traveling to India to find spiritual truth? Well, it's because the spiritual truth isn't in the West, at least. In Israel, it's different. But in the West, a lot of deeper spiritual realities or theological realities of the Old Testament aren't communicated to Jews, and I was just one in a long line of those.
Okay, yeah, and Jesus wasn't an option, I take it.
No,
Yeah.
no. I grew up knowing I could be anything I wanted, just not a Christian.
I've heard that exact phrase from a lot of my now Christian friends.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
They're Jewish Christians. Jeff Morgan. I don't know if you're familiar with him. I had him on my channel a while ago. He lives in Israel, but he, in essence, said the same exact thing. You can be whatever you want. Just don't do that. Don't become a Christian.
Well, I went to a Jesuit high school as well, and so we could talk about that perhaps.
Oh, interesting. A Jesuit high school?
That was the best school in town, naturally. But I kind of went in with this knowledge that it's like I didn't know what the difference between Catholic and Christian was. Like I didn't have that degree of resolution in the sense of like Catholicism versus like say Protestantism. I didn't have that. I just knew that like I have to be hardened to whatever I'm going to hear. But I wouldn't say that I was ever given the gospel. In 4 years at a Jesuit school, I have no memory of anyone taking me aside and saying. I don't think the teachers would do that. I just don't think the high school probably wants to be, I don't know, ecumenical probably isn't the word, but I don't remember any of my fellow students talking to me about it. I never heard it even once. After all the going to mass that I did and all the theology classes, it was never, hey, the good news is Christ died for sins. I don't remember ever actually hearing that.
Interesting. It sounds like some churches today.
Indeed.
Unfortunately, yeah. That's
Yeah.
interesting. Okay, so you grew up in a Jewish household, pretty secular. Take us from there. How did your spiritual journey grow from there?
I think the big step that I took was in 1996. I graduated from high school and I went to school to college in the Bay Area. I went to Stanford in Northern California.
That's right.
And of course, Northern
Okay.
California in the late 1990s was a time of a couple different things. One was the dot-com boom. The tech boom was just starting to take off. And then also, well, three things actually: the tech boom, the DJ and rave scene, and then also a lot of the leftover mysticism of the 1960s, fueled by Esalen and places like that, was beginning to bubble up again, leading into the millennium. And so it was at Stanford that that I had the opportunity finally to begin expressing some more of my spiritual interest and take classes in Taoism, psychology, take classes in Jungian psychology. That was a big step as well, beginning to explore more religious traditions. So just sort of growing up, like being in the environment of it, being able to indulge my curiosity, that was a huge step.
So you just kind of glossed over the fact that you went to Baylor and Stanford?
No, I went to the Bay Area in Stanford.
Oh, okay. Like, oh yeah, no big deal. I just went to Stanford, no big deal. And I'm
Yeah.
like, hold on a second, back up. So, I mean, this is kind of a testament to, I want to say, your standard of, I would say intellect.
Hmm.
The way that you kind of deal with these things is you're not just going in kind of like in this wishy-washy kind of area or mindset. In fact, a lot of people that I know in that ended up really deeply in the new age are some of the brightest people I know. Stephen Bancars is one of them. He's
Absolutely.
very bright.
Hmm.
And so I think that that's a testament to deception, but we'll get to that
Yeah.
later.
Oh, absolutely.
Um, all right. So you went to a prestigious college.
Hmm.
You got this education. Is there anything there that happened? I remember listening to your testimony a while ago. And I remember there was some stuff that went on in your college years, spiritually speaking. Take me to that. Am I remembering that correctly?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that sort of started the process when I was there was I read Carl Sagan's book, The Demon Haunted World. Well,
Hmm.
first I saw the movie Contact, which I loved at the time. I have some real issues with it now, but then I read the book The Demon Haunted World, and that was the first time that I had read a book and it sort of cracked my head open and made me realize that there wasn't as much in there as I thought. That was the feeling that I had. It's like, wow, I'm really stupid. That was really the feeling that I thought. And I don't think that started an interest in atheism for me, like a lot of what Carl Sagan does. I think it was just kind of a reset, that a lot of ideas that I'd taken for granted, I might have been like 19, a lot of ideas that I had taken for granted, I needed to subject to greater scrutiny and go on a more intellectually kind of driven adventure and not simply accept a lot of things like astrology. Everyone kind of grows up hearing about astrology, like
Yeah.
it's just a thing. And then he, in that book, goes so hard against superstition and mysticism and these ideas that are running society. It's actually a very polemical, very powerful book. I think it's Carl Sagan is most powerful. So then I started reading a lot of his works. And I think Carl Sagan did ultimately have he wasn't an atheist. I think he had a spiritual viewpoint that he never quite discussed. Maybe at the end of the book Contact he does, which is why I still recommend that book. If you want to know who Carl Sagan really was, read the book Contact and read it all the way to the very last page. And I think that's who Carl Sagan was. But that sort of gave me an appreciation for nature as sort of a beginning of a spiritual kind of as a subject of spiritual inquiry. Let's just say that.
Where was Carl Sagan?
Where was he?
Yeah, like where would you put him as far as spirituality? I've always thought he was an atheist.
I think Carl Sagan was I think he was a monist. I think deep down he believed all is one, but he did seem to believe in a perhaps a consciousness, perhaps that was a transcendent spiritual consciousness. He was also very enthusiastically into smoking lots of weed, so like he was absolutely famous for that. Like he was not shy about it. I think there's a bit about him and his wife smoking weed in the shower or something like that, which is like that's commitment. So I think he had a mystical streak, but that his interest was mostly in getting rid of superstition and fuzzy thinking and getting people to think more clearly about the universe, but also behind it, more of a mystical kind of bent that would come along later, that informed, like he had a sense of wonder, let's put it that way. And I think that wonder gave him an openness to the idea that there was more than just raw matter, but it wasn't something that he ever talked about openly. And if you read Contact, and if you read it's a great book, it's very different from the movie. If you read it all the way to the end, I think that's where Carl Sagan reveals some of what his beliefs might be. It's a very, very powerful end of the book, actually.
I never knew that. Okay. Yeah, because I remember there were some developments there in your years at college.
Yeah.
All right, take us from there. What happened after college?
Well, so I at the end of my junior year, I stopped out to do a .com startup.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was a big thing that was happening. That was like 1998, 1999. And Stanford was very generous to us to say, like, you don't have to drop out and reapply for admission because so many people were doing it. Google, for example, was started on the Stanford campus. Because so many people were doing it, Stanford said, okay, you can leave for a sabbatical, essentially, and then you can come back whenever you want, but you just lose your guaranteed housing. So you have to take care of your own housing, but you don't have to reapply. And so I did a .com startup beginning in 1999. And so, we, praise God, were able to raise millions of dollars from private and institutional investors. And I was like 21 years old, something like that. I wasn't the CEO, but I had a number of founders with me. And in the .com world, like we were working very hard during the week and partying very hard on the weekends, which is basically how the tech world kind of works when the money's really flowing. And it was at that time that I got introduced to the DJ and rave scene. On New Year's Eve 2000, my sister actually brought me to a rave in Phoenix. I was visiting family for Christmas and New Year's on break. And she took me to a rave on New Year's Eve 2000, and she gave me an ecstasy pill, which was the first time I'd ever done any drugs. And my life took a very hard left turn. Let's put it that way.
I remember the rave scene. I was so close one time to doing ecstasy, and I didn't have the guts for it. It's scared me. But yeah, I remember that. There was a whole world behind the rave scene. So that was your first experience with ecstasy, and it grew from there, didn't it? Did you ever try DMT?
I did, but much later.
Much later. Okay. All right. So that was kind of like a pivot for you. How so? Explain that a little bit more.
Well, that was when I, excuse me, I was a really straight-laced, straight-edge kind of kid. Like I showed up at this rave wearing clothes you'd probably wear to a club, except I was wearing this giant pair of angel wings that my sister had given me. They were like hitting people in the face and stuff like that. It was ridiculous. But like it was suddenly like I had, I guess what you'd call like a spiritual awakening, like an awakening to the cosmos and my own inner nature and my own desires and dreams. That's where I found the desire to travel, which will show up much later, about 15 years later. And I guess that was my first awakening. Like, wow, this is this whole new world that I have no basis of understanding. I knew the world of school. I knew the world of professionalism and .com and boardrooms and stuff like that. And so now I get exposed to the rave scene, which is very much not that, which is, like music, bright flashing lights, ecstatic experiences, not just the drug, but the experience of dancing. And then all the values that inform the rave scene, which were like an iteration on a lot of 1960s Woodstock values, but brought forward into a more technological age. So instead of guitars, you have turntables, right? Instead of drums, you have drum machines. And then you begin incorporating a lot of these syncretic beliefs that had actually been around for quite a while. For example, informed by Terence McKenna. He wrote a book called The Archaic Revival. And so that book was very seminal for a lot of people. I think he wrote it in the early 1990s. And he wrote in that book about a sort of fusion of technological culture with more archaic archaic culture. So harvesting the past of more primitive and tribal peoples, but their spiritual knowledge, and applying it to a technological society. And so that was the archaic revival. And I remember that first summer or so, when I met all my rave friends, that book was a subject of conversation, along with Ram Dass, Be Here Now, and the Tibetan book of Living and Dying. I can't remember who wrote that one. So we were definitely exploring sort of Eastern, mystical, esoteric, spiritual ideas. And that was part of the culture. I managed to find a lot of friends who were also educated and successful and professionals. And that was what we were doing. Like, that was what we were doing on the weekends. We're working really hard during the week, or even on Saturdays, we're having these transcendent experiences Friday or Saturday night, and then sitting around and talking about spiritual ideas, on Sunday. A big part of that world was mushrooms and LSD and stuff like that. And so this was just where we were all kind of at. Those of us, we were all in our 20s at that point. And so, that's what kids back then were doing. And so that was where a lot of my spiritual interest was sort of triggered and awakened, that suddenly I had gone from this very narrow view to this hard reset with Carl Sagan. And suddenly this door that blows open, and there's this whole big wide world of spirituality going back centuries in time and all that. It's like, oh, this is a big field I can go playing in. And so me being the way I am, that was very appealing to me.
What did you think of Christianity at that time?
I knew almost nothing about it.
Did you have any general feel about it?
I remember we were all sitting around one day, and I was thinking, and the only coherent thought that I had about Christianity at the time was my perspectives on Catholicism, because I couldn't have differentiated for you between Catholicism and Christianity more broadly. So I just thought that was Christianity, and I was like, Christianity seems awfully obsessed with sex. And so I thought, well, if I was thinking from an institutional perspective, if you can get control of a creature's sex drive, you can control basically anything else about them. And that was the thought that I had at the time. That was basically the only cohesive thought that I had about Christianity.
I would say it works on both sides, though, too. Yeah.
Well, yeah, of course.
Yeah.
I've learned since then, it's not about control in the sense of manipulation. Like, it can be control in the sense of manipulation. It's about self-control and discipline and morality. But I didn't have those categories at the time. Morality wasn't something that we talked about. Right and wrong. These were ideas that we lived out every day. People would do things that were wrong, and everyone would get their feelings hurt or worse. But no one ever would sit down and say, well, hold on, let's get presuppositional about this. Why is this wrong? We never asked that question. And that'll show up again much later in my own story.
Yeah, it's one of those things where you don't care until you're forced to. When it comes to morality, or the things that seem out there, and then all of a sudden, when it becomes personal, then you enter the fight. You're like, oh, this is wrong, or oh, this is right. When it becomes something you have to deal with, or you default. It sounds like you defaulted a little bit to like a relativistic worldview when you read Carl Sagan. That's what it sounds like to me, right? Would you agree with that?
I think so. It wasn't quite so clear. It was because I was working very hard in college, and I was working very hard in my .com days. So my life as a sophomore in college, and then was very constrained and narrow. As I got into the rave scene, and as the .com world blew up and sort of fell away, my life became more about this rave scene and about this kind of chosen family of a lot of people. In fact, I remember in 1996, I was a freshman in college. We were sitting in a dorm room, just a bunch of the kids on the floor. I realized 50% of the people in 1996, 50% of the kids came from broken homes. Myself included. My parents got divorced when I was 19, and so in the rave world, it was that, if not more. Right. And so what you have a bunch of people kind of forming this chosen family. Like, okay, our own families are in tatters, and maybe people come from abuse and other kind of bad situations. So we're going to be a chosen family amongst ourselves. So the worldview was the morality was relativistic, but sort of relativistic around like social norms that we all just kind of agreed upon that weren't actually based on anything. And that would, and the the problem with that would show up from time to time, particularly like the Bay Area is famous, of course, for like promiscuity. And so, people would be cheated on or people would be getting into polyamory and stuff like that. And everyone would have a strong feeling about that, but ultimately no one could say innately why it was wrong. Right. But they just felt it was wrong, but couldn't do anything about it. And so that kind of led to the chosen family be torn apart by its own lack of ability to determine standards. So it was relativistic in the sense that we just kind of had our own group values and with nothing to base it on. But it wasn't like we ever sat around and said, our values are relative to other people. It was just us trying to hold together as kids from broken homes, essentially.
Yeah, you'd think that while you guys are philosophizing on a Sunday,
Yeah.
that those deeper things would come up. It's very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you're in the scene, you're kind of growing in your spirituality in that way, probably not in the most positive way or Christ-like way.
Yeah.
And take us from there. How did you go from that to traveling and kind of maybe a slight U-turn here at
Mm-hmm.
some point? Because I know that your relationship with your mother plays a part at some point. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Okay.
that comes up a little bit later. I think that
Okay.
the next big step was when I finished the .com and went back to school to finish my degree. So I went back as a senior. This was in September of 2001. So I've come off of summer 2001, which was like probably the biggest kind of party year ever, and then I go into college. September 2001, and so 9/11, of course, is about to happen. So there's a lot that's happening in my world where the .com world is crashing and everyone's starting to figure out what they have to do. The Bay Area economy is just devastated, and everyone's like the party has really ended in a pretty powerful way. By the way, if anyone wants to watch a movie, it's a fiction movie, but that captures the spirit of the rave scene quite well. I've realized the movie is called Groove. It was made in the late 1990s, and it's essentially like a story very similar to mine, where a straight edge guy from the corporate world goes to a rave, and what happens to him. So if anyone wants to kind of see what I'm talking about, you can watch that movie. It's actually a pretty well done independent film. And so then 9/11 happens, and 9/11 was a big shock to the system, of course, for everybody. But it's at that point that I go back to school and I take a course on Jungian psychology. And that's where I get introduced to the idea that these big theological concepts aren't just out there, they're in here. Like that's what Carl Jung did, is he took mysticism and he made it personal. And so that's when I realized that all of these mystical concepts could be used to facilitate my own growth in a desired direction. Because you're right that I'm still working relativistically. I don't have a direction to be conformed in. I don't have a Christ to be conformed to. I get to determine who I want to become. And so that was how Carl Jung was so powerful for me. It's like, oh, wait a minute. I get to change what's going on up in here. So if I'm finding that my way of interacting with the world is inefficient, meaning it's not producing the results that I want, I can change up here. I can grow and evolve spiritually in my mind and in my heart and my spirit in a direction that I want to go. And that was the first time that I'd ever gotten that idea. And the way that it showed up was actually in a discussion of Lord of the Rings. And this, I'll never forget this. So the movies were about to come out at the time. I think the Fellowship was just about to come out, or had just come out, something like that. And the professor was talking about all of the characters in the Lord of the Rings are different parts of men's psychology that are journeying on the way towards wholeness or fulfillment.
I'm sure that's what Tolkien meant.
Yeah, exactly right. It's a Jungian reading of the Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
So you have characters in opposition and in balance. You have Boromir versus Aragorn, and you have Aragorn's growth path and Gandalf's growth path, and each of these different characters are different pieces of the male psyche. And that was really interesting to me because, I had grown up thinking that the only valid way to be a man was the frat boy, pizza eating, beer drinking kind of guy. That was what culture had shown me. I felt it had shown me, this is how you be a man. And I was never that. I could never be that. Right. And so once I realized that, wait a minute, the Lord of the Rings is portraying multiple valid ways of being a man. I've said this many times on my own podcast, that Gandalf never looks at Aragorn, who never looks at Legolas or Gimli and says, I don't think you're man enough. Right? They just kind of all accept that though they're very, very different characters with different skills and abilities, that they all can be aligned for common purpose. And that's when it clicked for me, like, wait a minute, there's multiple valid ways to be a man. And so a lot of my journey that would take place after that was sort of this dual pursuit of trying to understand what it means to be a man, which is what ultimately led me to the manosphere, which I'm sure we'll get to later, but then also discovering the truth about God and spirituality in the universe. And I felt that those two were connected, that having answers to one means answers to the other.
Carl Jung is another character that I really want to dig into on my channel more, but it doesn't
Mm-hmm.
surprise me that he was the
Mm-hmm.
one who kind of sparked that kind of pursuit, that kind of spiritual pursuit. Okay, so you're kind of an amalgamation of many things at this point.
Yeah.
You don't strike me as being very old, but like you're a senior in college at
Mm-hmm.
this point,
Mm-hmm.
and you've been looking into these different psychologists, this different kind of mysticism, and we're not even to the point where you're kind of like in so deep. So take
Right.
us from after this point. What was your next big jump?
I think my next big jump was in 2006 when my mother passed away very suddenly.
Mm.
And so that led me from putting the pieces together. You have this big field of mysticism, Buddhism and archaic revival and Hinduism in the 1960s and all this different stuff floating out there. Carl Jung then makes it personal, like, oh, wait, this is about me and my own relationship with myself as well. So it goes from out there to in here. And then trauma introduces me to the idea that there's much more going on inside me that I'm consciously aware of. And so that's when I got introduced to EMDR, which is a form of depth psychology therapy of going into sort of traumatic memories and recognizing that there's more stored, sort of in the psyche, if you will, than we're consciously aware of. And that led me into the world of psychotherapy. And so the pieces are all beginning to kind of click together as, this big world, this big spiritual world, this big mystical outside begins going inside to my conscious awareness and then going into the subconscious as well.
Can you break down a little bit more of what EMDR is
Mm-hmm.
and what your opinions are of it currently?
Yeah. So for those who don't know, EMDR stands for eye movement deprogramming, reprocessing, something like that.
Yeah.
And so the modality, it's not quite like hypnosis, because hypnosis is a state that you're not in control in. You're induced into a hypnotic state, and you can't get yourself out of the hypnotic state, is my understanding. EMDR is, but bears some similarity where, at least in the way that it was done with me, there was a device, a pair of headphones, and then a pair of little vibrating paddles, essentially like key fobs, really. And so the therapist has a little knob that she could turn, and that would make the left ear beep and the left hand vibrate, and then it would go back and forth between the two. And by changing the speed of the modulation from slow to fast, a different depth of I don't know, I guess inner awareness could be created. I think Bessel van der Kolk talks about it in The Body Keeps the Score. And so it was used as a way of going into particularly traumatic memory. And the problem was that, although I didn't think this was a problem at the time, at the very bottom of that experience, as I'm really confronted with, the memory, the therapist asked a question that was surprising to me. She said, "What do you believe to be true about yourself in this moment?" And I remember, like, I'm just totally deep in it and, crying and all this different stuff as I'm seeing what's going on. And I was like, that's an interesting question. That's not what I would have expected her to ask here. So ultimately, whatever experience that I was able to have of going back into a memory that perhaps I had suppressed, it came back to, what do I believe to be true about myself? It ultimately became self-referential. And I think that is a problem.
Mm.
It's not, let's evaluate, what happened from a position of scripture. What does God have to say about this? It's like, what do you believe to be true about yourself? Self-limiting beliefs. And so but that was where I was at in my own spiritual journey, because again, we go from the outer to the inner to the deep inner. How are my own self-limiting beliefs driving, at the deep subconscious layer, driving my conscious thoughts, which is then driving my life? And so the idea began to develop in me. This was something that I was putting together myself, just in terms of all the things that I knew, that the healing of trauma can generate a renewed mind, can then generate a desired life. And that sort of became my spirituality, right? And I think that describes a lot of New Age spirituality, as that ultimately it's personal fulfillment driven, to confront self-limiting beliefs inside yourself. And it points to lots of different spiritual traditions out there in the world that seem to indicate that and reinforce it. So that was sort of the theology that I began to develop at the time.
Okay, let's park here for just a second and
Sure.
unpack that a little bit, because
Yeah.
I think that so many people struggle with this, because some of that is true, right? Where it's like there's, like talking about New Thought, right? Where
Mm.
it's the positive thinking movement, right? And it's all about change your thoughts, change your life, which it is true, right? Like that can be true, where um, your attitude can actually affect your relationships. And there's a kind of like a linear way of looking at that cause and effect, where it's not just this huge spiritual truth, it's just a truth. How about you kind of unpack that a little bit? Because the way that you put it, where it's like, okay, my inner core life, I see it like a like the earth, right? You have the core in the middle, the crust, and then the outside. Um, Kind of seeing that as a human being,
Mm.
where some of that is true, where
Hmm.
if you can actually change what's going on in here, it will help your life, and it will ultimately help you deal with trauma. What in your experience is true about that, and what is false about it?
Hmm. It lies in the word change. There's a difference between change and transformation. From a
Hmm.
we'll say a secular perspective, yes, you can change your thoughts and you can change your life, right? You can say, wow, because of my childhood trauma, this is not what I said to myself, but this is very common.
Mhm.
And we'll get to ayahuasca later, and you see a lot of this in the ayahuasca psychedelics community. In fact, Michael Pollan, the author, has a famous book, How to Change Your Mind. It's very interesting that he uses the word how to change your mind.
Mm.
So you can say, I would like to change my mind. I've been traumatized and I was brought up to be an overachieving kid. And now I have this corporate job and I'm miserable commuting to work an hour each way. And because of this childhood trauma that was done to me by my parents, I would like to change my thoughts and become a traveling circus performer. And so you can go in and yes, you can change your thoughts. You can change your mind. You can even change these beliefs and morality that you have. Where did these come from? These were imposed upon you traumatically, by your oppressive parents. And you can change your mind about that and you can do and be whatever you want. You can break all of these commitments because they were the false you making those commitments. You can, divorce your wife or divorce your husband. You can quit your job. You can sell it all and change because you're just, you're redefining yourself. You're changing yourself completely. Yeah, there is truth to that. But from a Christian perspective, we're not called to change. We're called to transformation, being renewed in the image of Christ. And that there is a component of change to that, but it's change in a particular godly direction, a God-defined direction. And so if you're self-defining your own relativistic morality to change going that way, right, that's not the goal. That is not the goal for the Christian life. I've learned that. We'll see this shows up much later. But to be transformed, to have your mind renewed, to be conformed to the image of Christ is what people are truly, truly seeking. Change is not ultimately satisfying because you can change yourself once, and if you don't like it, you get yourself in trouble, you change yourself again, where are you ultimately going?
Mm.
It's a real good way to end up in lots of really ugly ditches. But if you're renewed in the image of Christ, you lead a more godly, God-glorifying and righteous life, which is where true peace and happiness can be found.
I think it's embodied in the scripture where Jesus is talking about it. He's the bread of life,
Hmm.
the living water. He's the end game. It's like everything that you're striving for and looking for. It's him. It's all found
Hmm.
in him. That's a very
Hmm.
interesting way to put it. Oh,
Hmm.
I like that. I like the way you put that, change versus transformation. So I'm
Hmm.
glad we parked on that for a second. Now,
Yeah.
all right. Now moving forward from there, you have this. When's the next big jump here in your spiritual journey?
Hmm. I think the next big jump after that would have been when I found my way into men's groups, the New Warrior
Wow.
training adventure. Yeah.
About around what
Um,
year would you say this is?
this is now 2013.
Okay, got it.
So let's see, EMDR would have been 2008. And as I'm working in the Bay Area at this time, living in San Francisco, engaging in psychotherapy mostly, I think was the pursuit. Lots of reading, but it was in 2013, and then in 2010 and 2011, I became part of Occupy Wall Street in San Francisco, and
Mm.
so I was like many others in Occupy Wall Street. I was upset about the way the big banks had been bailed out, and I thought that was kind of criminal that the American people had been saddled with the bill. And so for about a year, I was working full time during the day, and then I gave up all of my hobbies to be part of Occupy Wall Street. And I ran the San Francisco City email list, and I was showing up to meetings, and I was part of a working group, and all of that. And I throw that in just because we've talked about the woke right, and a lot of people know that woke came from the left. But when I was part of Occupy, this is how the left has changed so much. When I was part of Occupy, the center of liberal activism in the Bay Area in like 2010 and 2011, there was no wokeness. I was still the same 6 foot tall white guy. I was bald, didn't have a beard at the time, and no one ever told me to check my privilege. No one ever deprived me of the people's microphone, where you kind of speak in short phrases and people repeat them, right? No one ever told me that I couldn't do that. There was a moment in time where I think the left had the opportunity to be really effective
Hmm.
in changing the public dialogue for the betterment of the people. They then completely abandoned that entirely and got taken over by the woke mind virus. And I actually watched that happen in San Francisco, between 2011 and 2013. So I wanted to just kind of throw that in. We
Wow.
don't have to park there if you don't want to, but we can.
You and I have talked about this before, guys. If you haven't seen, if you haven't seen my video with Will about the woke right, please watch it. If there's any video that you're going to watch on my channel this next year, that's the one I would say to watch, because that's the one you'll have to care about it. Okay, you're going to
Mm,
be forced to care about it whether you want to or not. I want you to be prepared, because it's what you're saying. I had no idea what this was until 2020, and
yeah.
here you are talking about dealing with this back in the early, well, maybe, mid early 2010s.
Yeah.
And I mean, I'm having babies. I'm getting married. I'm dealing with my own stuff, and I have
Hmm.
no idea that there's this cultural phenomenon that's about to take over our entire country, spread out throughout the world, and people saw it years and years before. So
Hmm.
that's just a really interesting thing to kind of sit on for just a second, because that's, again, with the woke right, it's something that people saw coming. I remember it was our friend Kevin Briggs.
Hmm.
Yeah, Kevin Briggs. I always want to say Briggins, but Briggs. And Monique Dusan. 2020 happened, and Monique was my first touch of understanding what's going on with the woke left.
Hmm.
And I remember it was at that point, she's like, "Yep, same thing's gonna happen on the right." I'm like, "What?" And I had no context for that at all until about 5 years down the line. So I just think that's interesting that you were there for it, that you kinda saw that transition. Now, okay, kinda sit there, maybe transition a little bit more into getting into the manosphere. Did that
Hmm.
play a part? Did you see any difference in that world during that time?
That's where what I would later learn was wokeness first showed up, actually,
Okay.
surprisingly. So I want to around the word manosphere. So
Yeah.
I to just to be precise about terms, because the manosphere now is part of a documentary on Netflix, with a bunch of influencers, with deeply misogynistic and contradictory views that Louis Theroux, that he took that all apart. So that describes what I describe as one half of the men's movement. What I
Okay.
found in 2013 was another half, which was called the mythopoetic men's movement. So the mythopoetic men's movement goes back to the early 1990s. 1980s, and it really began with the book Iron John by Robert Bly. And so the retreat that I attended in 2013, called the New Warrior Training Adventure, was based on the works of Robert Bly and by the teachings of Carl Jung, filtered through the book King, Warrior, Magician, Lover. And so it was like Jung's teachings had propagated forward into the conversation around what does it mean to be a man. That landed in the 80s and 90s and began spreading forward from there, and that became the mythopoetic men's movement. And that's what I encountered in 2013. So I differentiate between the mythopoetic men's movement and the manosphere. I think they're two
Okay.
separate strains, because the manosphere was very focused on men's outer lives, fitness, money, and getting lots of girls, right? That's
Andrew Tate.
Andrew Tate, exactly.
Got it.
The mythopoetics were not so focused on that. They were focused on men's inner lives, guilt, shame, trauma, stuff like that. But rarely, if ever, spoke about job performance, building wealth, prosperity, never really talked about any of that. It was mostly men confronting their own inner emotional state. So the mythopoetics talked about men and their emotions. The manosphere talked about men and their performance. And these two halves never really seemed to know about each other. And this is jumping way ahead in time, but I just want to plant the seed. It was because of seeing those two halves that I started my own platform in 2020, which was called The Renaissance of Men, because I wanted to show men how those two halves actually needed to be put together. We'll get to that way later.
Okay.
But so just to talk about the mythopoetics, that's what I found in 2013. And that was a weekend-long men's initiation in Northern California. There had ultimately been hundreds of them all over the world, actually, for many years, and 60,000 men had been initiated. And it was at that retreat, there were men from all walks of life, all ages, from early 20s into their 70s, who were all grappling with the same question: what does it mean to be a man? And I had been sitting with this question at this point for over a decade, and I thought it was just me. And so when I go to this retreat and I find that I'm not the only one, that there's 50 guys on the retreat, there was 50 guys on staff, and there were 60,000 men around the world at that point that had been initiated, I realized that the conversation about masculinity was so much bigger than I realized. That it was much, much more than just me. And so that was probably the next really big step. And that retreat was informed by Jungian kind of principles, archetypes, and king, warrior, magician, lover. And so you can, again, start to see how things are starting to come to a point from big world of mysticism, Jungian psychology, trauma, getting to my central question of what does it mean to be a man. It all crystallizes right there in 2013.
And that explains a little bit of the background with your identity as a man.
Mm-hmm.
Take us forward. What happens next?
Well, that was when I found my way into men's groups. So it was the first time, and I found a male therapist. I had seen therapists across the years, and they'd all been women therapists. And I realized that, some of the things I wanted to talk about, I realized that on some level that I don't think I could have articulated that men and women are different, But growing up in the coming of age in the Bay Area, that's like a forbidden idea just environmentally, atmospherically. It's never really stated that men and women are the same, but they're kind of living the same, right? And children are put off or put aside even in many cases. And so I had begun to develop this idea after going on this retreat, no, men are different. And when men get together, we can talk about things as men that women simply can't understand.
Mm-hmm.
So it was at that moment in 2013, that was when I found my way into weekly men's groups. So we'd meet every Monday night in a therapist's office, and I would see that same therapist on Thursday. And so that was when I started digging into what it means to be a man, both in terms of not just my own inner state, which what I do in the therapist's office, but sitting around with men in circle every Monday night, we got to talk about what's actually going on in our lives. And it wasn't the therapist doing group therapy. He was there facilitating the group, kind of keeping things on the rails, keeping guys from getting into arguments or, just keeping not getting into talking about sports or politics.
Yeah.
Let's keep it focused on our lives. And that was really handy because it became very much about changing our lives as men. And actually, that was the first time, believe it or not, that I ever encountered wokeness. It was in one of those groups that a man turned to me and said, "Check your privilege." And it was like, "Check your privilege." And I was like, "What is that?" I didn't understand. He just said it and it sounded like a whip crack. And I was like, "I don't know what you just said. I don't know what that means, but whatever you just did was supposed to get me to shut down."
Yeah.
And that was my thought. And that was what was that? It was some sort of psycho-political tactic that was used, and that was my first experience of real wokeness. And so you mentioned in 2020, later when everyone started seeing it in 2020, I just took it for granted. This was the water that I had kind of been living in many ways for years. So it's funny that was most people's introduction to it.
Yeah, no, it hit me like a freight train. All right, so that's your first experience with that. You're kind of developing at this point.
Mm-hmm.
What's the next step from that?
The next step was over the course of less than 2 years of seeing a therapist weekly and being in this men's group and treating my own personal growth almost like it was a job, because I still had the belief that I could change myself by healing myself of trauma, right?
Mm.
So I would go to see the therapist on Thursday, and we would go into various forms of Gestalt therapy, like what's happening in your body now. Let's go into that, and visualization and stuff like that. So stuff would come up that I would deal with, and then and then it would come up, and I would get home and rest and reflect on it, and then I would bring it to the group, not in any massive amount of detail, but going back and forth between the assistance of men in the group and with the therapist, I finally had the ability to confess that I was in a codependent relationship, and it was that codependent relationship that was that I'd been in for a long time, that I knew that I had to leave, that I had to grow out of,
Mm.
and through being in that group of men, I was able to confess that I was in a codependent relationship and end it. And I think it'd be important to talk about what codependent relationships are as well.
Please do.
So, one of the reasons why I so appreciate the Christian teaching on courtship is that courtship is a process of vetting someone to properly be a wife or a husband. You're subjecting someone to, we might call it biblical scrutiny, to see if, first of all, do they love God? Do they love Jesus? But also, is this a good and healthy partner for you? And the secular world has no principles by which people get into relationships. Usually like a one-night stand or a hookup leads to some sort of relationship, somehow for a number of months. Everyone's riding high on their hormones. And then after 3 months, you get in the first big fight when the hormones wear off, and then you decide to re-up for another 3 months or whatever. And then you just keep going forward. And that's, the ones who survive that gauntlet are the ones who get married. And, maybe they shouldn't be married, but, they've just been together long enough. I saw this happen all the time in the Bay Area. They've just been together long enough, like, well, we should probably get married and start thinking about kids. And so they kind of stumble forward into marriage, and the marriages are unfulfilling because the people weren't ultimately meant to be together for various reasons, and then they have kids, and then if a divorce happens because someone gets introduced to childhood trauma, and then they change, and the whole family structure gets shattered, and it's really ugly. And that's what it's like out there in the secular world. Perhaps some of your listeners can relate. So a codependent relationship is a relationship where both partners agree to play we might call them unbiblical roles, and that unbiblical role keeps them locked in relationship. Usually it's one person needs to be the caretaker and the other person needs to be cared for. And so that can be very fulfilling. You get lost in the oceanic oneness of sexual bliss, and you kind of lose, sight of the red flags that are sailing by. And then people fall into this pattern where one person's the caretaker, the other person needs to be cared for. And that feels really good and feels really stable, except no growth is possible in it. Because if one person decides, I don't want to be a caretaker anymore, I have other things I want to do, well, then the other person that they've been in love with, so to speak, or been in a relationship with, they get left behind. Or if one person decides, I don't want to be cared for, I want to grow and become my own person and live my own life, then they leave the caretaker behind. So the codependent relationship becomes a trap out of which no growth is possible. And it becomes this kind of like death spiral, and maybe those people get married in that codependent relationship, and it's just all badness from there. Well, I had put so much energy into my own personal growth as a man that I decided I no longer wanted to be cared for. I wanted to stand on my own 2 feet as a man and go find out who I am and what I could do. And I was in a codependent relationship. I had to make the very hard decision to leave and to facilitate my own growth and hers. It was very, very difficult to do, but I knew that I wasn't doing it because I wanted to hurt her. That was definitely not my intention. But I knew that ultimately, and one of the big reasons is I wanted to become a husband and a father, and that wasn't in the cards for that relationship. And so I had to get real comfortable with the fact that I had grown up and come of age in the Bay Area where, marriage is oppressive and children are patriarchy and they're cancer on the planet and all the different stuff. And I had to get real comfortable with the fact, like, no, this is something that I want and it's innately good. And it is okay if I go to pursue this without intending to cause any harm. And so that was probably one of the biggest shifts in my life, was taking a definitive step forward towards something that I believe was righteous and true and good, but I was the only one in my entire world who believed that. And I was like, but I knew within myself that this was something that it's not wicked, it's not evil, it's something that I was made to be and do as a man, and this is the direction that I'm going to go. And that was what triggered a lot of growth that would come after.
That's interesting that you had that kind of view before you were a Christian, because I
Mhm.
would agree with that. As a Christian, I'm like, yeah, it's good to get married and have kids, and that's I would say that that's a good thing at that point, that at least
Mhm.
you had that kind of anchor
Mhm.
for it. All right,
Yeah.
so
Well,
go
can
ahead.
I just add,
Sure.
so one of the things that as I've been thinking about my testimony over the years since becoming a Christian,
Mhm.
one of the things that has become really clear was that God was with me the entire way, even when I didn't know him.
Yeah.
I was his from before the foundations of the world.
Mhm.
And as I look back and I think about the various stages that I've gone along when I've been deeply in error, deeply deceived, deluded, and wrong, God still had me. And he still gave me a living conscience and a desire to know him, even when I didn't know who he was, even when I was pointed 180 degrees in the opposite direction of the gospel. 180, I started life. You can be anything you want except for Christian. And so I went running off in that direction
Yeah.
as fast as I could with all of my faculties, going to explore everything except for Christianity, because that was always the option that was excluded. But even then, God was with me, and it was through no inherent goodness of my own,
Mhm.
none at all. It was just God giving that to me long before I knew him. That would come much later. So my story is his story.
It reminds me of I think it's the C.S. Lewis book Magician and His Nephew. I think it's that one
Hmm.
where the character is kind of lamenting, right? I think it's at the end of the book, and I'm sorry if I'm butchering it, but the idea is what I'm trying to get across is that, he's lamenting, he's going through all this stuff and wondering you know, where God is, basically, is the idea. And at the end of it, basically, it's shown that no matter what he went through, like Aslan's over here walking next to
Yeah.
him the entire time, basically.
Hmm.
And that's what I see in my head whenever I hear stories like that,
Hmm.
where he was there the whole time in his providence. And it's
Hmm.
just, I love God's providence. And it
Absolutely.
makes
And
sense looking back on it now.
oh yeah, at the time, I didn't know where I was going at all. I was just figuring it out one step in front of the other. Another thing I want to say is there's nothing wrong with caring for each other
Hmm.
in relationship. There's nothing wrong with that at all. It's where caring becomes a role that you play at the
Mm.
expense of all other roles. Right. Instead, it's like where Joe Rigney has this book called The Sin of Empathy. It's quite a controversial book in many ways, but there's a way in which caretakers can throw themselves in to need to be the person who rescues the person who can't care for themselves. That's where you've departed from a biblical understanding of care and kindness and become self-sacrificial on their behalf, right? And that's where the person gets
Yeah.
to try and be in savior and the other person gets to try and be saved and all of that. That's where the real danger lies. There's nothing wrong with extending a hand of caring to someone that you love or someone that you're even married with, but where you throw yourself in to their predicament as the one who's trying to save them or as the one who needs to be saved, that's where things go wrong.
Yeah, I think that's where I think a lot of enabling behavior can come from
Yes,
too.
that's
Yeah,
the word.
where
Yeah,
yeah, you're an enabler.
that is exactly, and being an enabler is exactly the word.
Yeah.
It's exact, or having, or being the one. Well, it's kind of, they're both enabling each other,
Yes.
right? Like
Yeah.
someone sacrificing themselves to save someone else. Whatever my need to be saved is enabling something within them, right? So it's a mutual enabling. That's why it's codependent, right?
It's like a toxic trauma bond
Yeah.
that you can't just get out of so easily. So good on you for making that hard decision.
Praise God. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So you broke off the relationship, you're working on this stuff. Take us to the next step in your
Hmm.
story here.
One thing that I need to say, just
Sure.
that was also going on during this time. So
Mhm.
I went on that men's retreat in 2013, and it was around that time that I got into the conspiracy world. Um,
Oh,
so
yes.
and that'll show up later with a lot of the woke right stuff.
Mhm.
And so I went on this men's retreat, and I was actually, Burning Man's going to come back in the story in just a minute. I first went to Burning Man in 2003. And by the way, the first Google Doodle ever, remember, that they still do,
Mhm.
was of the Burning Man logo.
Yeah,
I believe it was
Carl Tykryp told me that. Yeah.
shout out Carl. Yeah,
Shout
absolutely
out to
true.
Carl. Yeah.
Shout out to Carl. So, so I went to Burning Man first in 2003, and then I went back in 2013.
Okay.
And so it was around that time that I found my way into the conspiracy world because I found a guy on Facebook who was arguing against climate change from actually this is the first time I've thought about this in a long time.
Yeah.
He was the first person I'd ever heard arguing against climate change from a perspective that wasn't Christian, right? Because I was used to Christians saying climate change isn't real, because Jesus or whatever, but he wasn't arguing from that at all. And so I began exploring some of his stuff. And so began this deep dive into the conspiracy world. And that ultimately led me to discovering an occult mystery school that was giving lessons in tarot and Kabbalah through the mail. And so I started doing occult mystery school training in 2013, which I did then for another about 2.5 years actually, of daily tarot study, where the tarot cards were not used as a fortune-telling tool. They're like the comic book version of Kabbalah. So by studying these cards, you learn the esoteric system of Kabbalah and what it means around magic and the ability to work your will in the world. So I began studying deep into the conspiracy world in 2013 and also began studying Western occultism at that same time.
Okay, hold on. Let's park here for just a
Sure.
second. That's
Yeah.
quite the jump.
Yeah.
Um, what kind of conspiracies and how did that connect to the occult things that you were learning?
Yeah. So a lot of my thinking about conspiracy started when I was in Occupy, because I would go to these meetings and this group of people would be talking about the spotted owl, and this group of people would be talking about oil and climate change, and this group of people would be talking about the rainforest, and this group of people would be talking about the big banks. And I was like, I don't think that all of these phenomena are disconnected. I think there's something underneath all of them that's driving them. And so that was when I sort of started asking a lot of questions about that. And my introduction to the conspiracy world was sort of like, I don't know, what conspiracy have you got? From 9/11 to
Okay.
what else?
Flat Earth.
Like JFK. I never really encountered the flat Earth
Sure.
stuff. I never took that seriously at all. It seemed that there were too many aspects of reality that flat Earth didn't explain, like the seasons. I don't think flat Earth has a good answer for that. And actually watching the sun come up over the horizon, which
Yeah.
you can do, it's like that happens. It doesn't just recede into the distance. So I never got into flat Earth, but it was basically like all of the conspiracy stuff. That was when I began a really serious sort of exploration, sort of that, the dark forces, New World Order kind of driving things in a more
Illuminati,
abstract.
that kind of stuff.
Illuminati,
Okay.
Anunnaki, yeah, all that stuff.
So is that where you got introduced to we've talked about this before, the protocols of the Elders of Zion?
Yeah, that was where I first heard about them.
Okay.
But they were always kind of spoken about in this way of like, that was kind of at the bottom of the conspiracy rabbit hole. And so I would hear people talk about them in that way, but I never actually read them. But yeah, that was and then you asked how the Western occultism became kind of a part of that. I guess I would say that Western occultism is the other side of the coin for Eastern mysticism. So Western occultism and Eastern mysticism are ultimately describing the same kind of all is one, create the world with your mind reality. But Eastern mysticism puts a happier, shinier, particularly in the New Age, kind of friendly face on it. But ultimately underneath, like Western occultism is all of that happy, shiny stuff kind of stripped away and put more towards working your will in reality. And you can see that when you go deep into Eastern mysticism, you ultimately encounter Kundalini yoga.
Yeah.
Kundalini yoga is, a form of essentially sex magic yoga, where you release the serpent energy from within you, and the serpent energy travels up to your third eye, giving you a cosmic awakening, and then you get magical powers. Well, lo and behold, as I start studying Western occultism, they're talking about the exact same thing. In fact, it shows up even in the tarot cards. Actually, I think it's like tarot card number 8, something like that. It's got a picture of a lion, a woman holding the lion's mouth open. And what I learned in my particular mystery school was that was a metaphor for Kundalini yoga. And so that same principle embodied in both East and West. So it became less about healing trauma, though that was still a part of it. And it became more about, I have the ability through innate aspects of my own being, my own spiritual being, to manifest my will on reality. And so that's both East and West kind of land in that place.
Okay. How does that tie in with conspiracy, though? Hash that out a little bit more for me. My brain cells are fighting.
Yeah. It's the
Yeah, because I know that you and I have talked about this before with the connection with a lot of occult stuff being tied to conspiracies.
Yeah. So in the conspiracy world, the Freemasons are ultimately Kabbalists. And so you can join the local chapter of your Freemasons and go to whatever meetings you want to go to. But ultimately, if you progress high enough in the Freemasonic grades, you are learning occult magic. And that shows up in a lot of their symbolism. Oh, what's the guy who wrote the book, that one. He's a Scottish Rite Freemason. It'll come to me in a moment. Albert Pike. There you go.
Okay.
That ultimately Freemasonry is occultic in nature, and the people who attain the highest degrees of Freemasonry, the 33rd degree, are ultimately a practicing occult forms of magic to work their will, not just in their own personal lives, but in reality broadly. And a lot of people say that Stanley Kubrick's movie Eyes Wide Shut is about that. That it's Tom Cruise's character going on a journey into a secret society, and what he discovers is ultimately like occult sex magic, like in these big ritualistic environments. So the occult studies, were I don't remember if they were positioned like this. They kind of were, as like the people who control the world. This is what they are doing ultimately, and so
I
that's
see.
so that's
Okay.
where that fits. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. It's kind of coming back to me now. Yeah, because like I remember, having a friend, former New Ager, interestingly,
Mm-hmm.
talking about all these supposed rituals that the celebrities are doing behind
That's
the
right.
scenes. And I was like, but how do you know that? You know what I mean? I was like,
Right.
I was curious because I'm like, but I mean, I wasn't ditching on him at all. I was like, but
Yeah.
where are you getting this information from? Right?
Yeah.
Like, where does this come from? Like Freemasonry, okay, but a lot of Freemasons are kind of ignorant to what even Freemasonry teaches. I mean,
Yeah.
even our friend Kyle will say that, right? Um, and so all these like deep kind of underground conspiracies, I'm like, well, how do we all know about it? Yeah, what do you think? What are your thoughts on that in general?
I mean, I think that those rituals are practiced.
Mhm.
Like the Theosophical Society. Aleister Crowley is a great example.
Yeah.
So Jack Parsons. Jack Parsons was one of the big guys at the early Jet Propulsion Laboratory. Like he was actively engaging in this stuff, and so it's not new. In fact, the mystery school that I was a part of linked its teachings back to ancient Egypt, actually, to
Mm.
Hermes Trismegistus, the Hermes the thrice great. And so out of all those teachings going back thousands of years or so, they claimed, that's what it was ultimately all about, was people using, magic. They wouldn't call it black magic, but there's no difference between black and white magic. I'm sorry, there just isn't.
Yeah.
We can talk about that separately. Using magic to work their will in reality. Now, are you actually manipulating reality with your mind? I don't think so. I think you're making contracts with spirits who can either give information or work other things, to your advantage. But I don't think you actually physically change reality with your mind.
Mhm.
That people will say you're co-creating reality with the divine mind or something like that, but I don't think that's true. That's true either. I think a lot of these people are participating in these rituals, but it's not because it's their will working on reality. I think that's just the loyalty that is that you pledge when you sell your soul. When you sell your soul to the devil, like how do you act that out?
Mhm.
You act it out. We're what's the term? I think it's Dr. Joe Boot who says this. It might not be, but like we are, man is made to worship. And so we will worship something. We will either worship God
Yeah.
or worship not God. And so if you have an occult view, if you have a will to power view, a Nietzschean view, a Crowleyan view, a theosophical view, that will ultimately express itself in worship. And I think these are acts of worship. To be really clear, I never did Kundalini sex magic rituals. I never did those. Right. So
Yeah.
my study was just about the cards and reading the lessons. It was really an academic study in many ways, but like it was it was never that to that degree. But I did get a window into them, and studying conspiracy stuff, it made sense. Like, okay, I'm learning these secret teachings, which were parceled out for 4 weeks at a time,
Mhm.
and so it didn't seem unusual to consider that there are people in high positions of power who are obviously seem quite wicked, who are engaging with these things as well.
What do you think about them now?
Which part?
The conspiracies.
I mean, I think they're real. I think it's a fallacy to say that there are no conspiracies.
Mm.
I think it's also a fallacy to say that everything is a conspiracy.
Mm.
I think it's ultimately a self-sealing view where it there's the comfort of anxiety, which is sort of like the conspiracies are controlling everything, and that reduces the uncertainty while producing a feeling of fear. And so it becomes a trap for that reason. I am not a coincidence theorist, nor am I an incompetence theorist. Coincidence theorists is, it's all just a coincidence. I don't believe that. I'm not an incompetence theorist to say, all that's happening is, honest people screwing up and it just doesn't work out. I think that there are people who exert influence, but influence is not deterministic. And I think God's sovereign hand is, is perhaps over all of it in a sense. But yeah, I absolutely think that there is a dark spiritual reality. That dark spiritual reality can be contacted, can be allied with, and people make contracts with spirits, and ultimately it costs them eternal damnation. I think that's very real. I don't think they have as much power, and I don't think it's as intentional as it may seem. I think there are people that are just greedy. I think just like simple sin, and I think people are manipulated, and I think people are just simply wrong. I don't think everyone is part of some giant meeting at Davos or whatever. And I think a lot of those people just share a worldview without needing to engage in occult rituals. But are there some who do practice this? Yes, I believe that history bears out the truth of that. But are they all one big coordinated entity? No, I think they're all fighting with each other all the time. And again, I think good people have more influence over their own lives, which makes a bigger difference than we tend to accept. That our own commitment to faithfulness and righteousness and holy habits, and living in a God-honoring way, and our real commitment to confession and repentance from sin can have far more influence on the world around us than most people even consider, because it's hard. It's easier to believe in a dark force that's more powerful than it is to simply say, yeah, I'm living in sin right now, and I really need to repent from that and build a godly life. It's easier to give that power away than to accept your weakness and live in God's strength.
Yeah, and so the dark ritual conspiracies and things like that specifically linked to the occult is kind of what you're referring to here, right?
Yeah.
Compared to something like, gosh, I think you mentioned 9/11 before, JFK. Because it seems like there's different categories, right? I tend to be very, very skeptical of conspiracy theories that there's no amount of evidence that will convince them that what happened because they're suspicious of everything, right?
Correct. Yeah.
I tend to be very skeptical about that because I'm like, in other words, you're kind of like a postmodernist in this way. There's no truth that can be known about this. You're going to submit or default to suspicion and no matter what you're told, right? Because you can't trust anybody versus like a 33 degree Freemason and occult rituals that are demonstrated.
The temptation of conspiracy theory is to believe that it has all the answers, and those tend to collapse into, particularly outside of the Christian world and increasingly in it, to some shadowy force behind the scenes that's manipulating everything from some small cabal of people that have control over everything. And that's the protocols of the elders of Zion. That it's ultimately, and this is at the bottom of the conspiracy world. The conspiracy world believes that some dark cabal of Jews are behind it all out of hatred for Christ, right? And that's a very soothing explanation in a sense, to believe okay, now I have the answer. But unless you subject that to the criticism of Scripture, of God's Word, right, you're going to be locked inside that prison. And Scripture is very clear about the influence of supernatural forces all throughout the New Testament. Sorcery isn't forbidden because it doesn't do anything, right? So it does actually work. And Paul himself says we don't deal against flesh and blood, but the wickedness in high places. And then there's a scene in Acts where a demon says to, I think it's one of the sons of Sceva, Jesus I know and Paul I recognize, but who are you? Right? It's like, had you met Paul, or is there interoffice email? What's going on there?
Yeah.
So I think there are coordinated spiritual forces that do work on humanity and on fallen men. I recommend the movie we spoke briefly before we started recording, the movie Nefarious, Steve Deace's movie. That's an excellent film. I really enjoyed that movie, that sort of talks about how an individual can become in league with darkness and give himself over to that. I think and of course we also see in the Exodus that the magicians in Pharaoh's court they don't fail to reproduce some of the miracles. They actually do reproduce them by their arts, right? And so I think that these things are very real, but you have to properly place them, not in a place where it becomes either a dark fascination or an overriding fear, because Christ is the good shepherd, leads me beside still waters. All these, like, we have this, it's covering this protection in a life of righteousness. And we do have more power than I think we do to push back on all that with the light, which is the consistent story of Scripture. But to deny that conspiracies actually happen, I think, is false. But to say that conspiracies drive everything and we have an absolute answer for every question, I think is equally false, because people are just wrong sometimes. How does that fit into the conspiracy? How does someone just pursuing a sinful end at the wrong moment fit in? Well, it does. It has to fit in somehow, and so it can't fit into one giant overarching answer that explains everything in this satisfying way. There has to be some ambiguity in it.
Okay, so that was a lot. We kind of had to hit that a little bit because that's a big thing. It's on my mind lately. Things that we kind of have to hash out there. So you're in the occult. There's conspiratorial stuff that you're kind of into. Play the movie forward. What happens after this?
Mm-hmm. So again, the big turning point was just me ending that codependent relationship. And so this is living in the Bay Area. This is late 2015, August 2015. And 1 week later, I go to Burning Man. Not for my first time. Again, it's my third time at the Burn. And that was another big shift for me.
So this is at Burning Man. When did you travel at all?
This would be after Burning Man.
Oh, okay. All right. So tell me about Burning Man, and then take us into your travels.
Mm-hmm. So while at Burning Man, and there's a whole story behind this, while at Burning Man, I find my way into a camp of Christian missionaries who had been going to the festival for 12 years at that point, ministering to the lost. They didn't advertise that they were Christians, because they rightfully recognized that if they just put up a big sign and cross, they probably wouldn't get a lot of people coming in. But they were just there to show seeking people the love of God the Father, which might be something that I know that many people today, Christians and otherwise, have never actually known. And so I found my way into their camp, and I had an experience after a 3.5 hour healing session with them. Excuse me. I saw what I believe was the face of Jesus Christ. I don't know that that's what it actually was, but I know that I saw a face. And then one of the women I was with, it was Barb, Katie, and Larry, were all in a circle with me. At the end of 3.5 hours of essentially a very healing conversation, Katie's standing behind me, and she's got her hands on either side of my head, and with my eyes closed, I see this vision of the playa. And so there's people riding their bikes, and the flags are flapping in the breeze, and there's tents and dust. And in the vision, this man walks up to me. He's wearing Burning Man goggles, and so I can kind of see the shape of his face and his hair. And I'm like, just looking, and the face seems to insist, without speaking, no, look. And so so I look, and so I take in the face, and then I open my eyes, and Katie says, "There's someone I want you to meet," and she leads me to the other side of the tent. This big pillar hanging from the ceiling. And so when I walked in, I saw one side of the pillar, and I could not have seen the other side. She leads me to the other side. She leads me around to the other side of the pillar, and she points up on the pillar, and on the pillar was the face that I had just seen with my eyes closed. And it was there's a painter named Akiane who painted images of Jesus Christ supposedly, and that was the painting. And so I'm asked, like, "Who are you people? What are you doing here?" I say, "Who are you people?" Like, "We're Christians." Like, "What are you doing here?" And so to date, like, all I know is what I saw. It wasn't some big transcendent vision. I don't think I got any sort of like revelation or anything like that. I saw what I saw, but that was an introduction to these wonderful, loving people. They were Camp Spirit Dream. They had been going to. They're more of a sort of charismatic branch, and again, they had been going to Burning Man for over a decade, and just growing the camp to the place it had come to. And they were again just there to show God the Father's love to the lost, including me. And so I befriended them, and but it was out of Burning Man that a couple. But I didn't become a Christian. That's a really important thing. Yeah. That was my introduction to Christ. And it was also at Burning Man that I got a contact after I hung out with them. They left on Saturday before the burn. So they would go to the festival from like Monday to Saturday, set up the tent, and they would always leave before the burn, because the burning of the man on Saturday night is when, a nice hangout with friends turns into a giant mess of a party, and they were never around for that. So they would always take off. And it was at the burning of the man that I met a contact who later would introduce me to ayahuasca, which is another part of my story. But it was after meeting my friends that I suddenly realized, like, wait a minute, I've had this dream of travel for 15 years, which I back at my first rave back in 2000. Suddenly, out of this relationship, I'm actually free to fulfill that dream. And so I walked out, having had this experience of these wonderful, loving Christian people. I wouldn't say that I had experienced Christ in any meaningful way, but I had met these loving Christian people, and I suddenly realized that I was free to fulfill my dreams of travel. And that's where my life again begins to turn in 2015 to when I left the United States in 2016.
I remember listening on another podcast to this part of the story, and you tell it so well, right? Because there's such respect for them and how they played a part. And it was just the way that they kind of showed you, oh, these are Christians. And then it kind of just handed the baton to this other part of your story, that God behind the scenes and his providence was kind of just using it all to draw towards him. Why don't you take us there? So if there's nothing in between from there that you want to add to your travels, let's go ahead and head there. Tell us about the ayahuasca. Tell us about the crazy things that you did, and the tattoos and all the things. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the one thing I want to add is that, the people that I met at Camp Spirit Dream, Rob and Katie and Barb and Andrea, I love them very much, and they're still friends and still in contact with them. They came to my wedding. Rob was one of my groomsmen. I kept in touch with them because I was very interested. It seemed to me, I went to go visit them for Christmas that year. I actually had some air miles on like Alaska Airlines, and they live up in Coeur d'Alene. And so I was like, okay, well, I've got these miles on this credit card. They had invited me, you should come visit sometime. I'm like, well, how about sometime is soon? And so they're like, okay, yeah, come up. And so I spent Christmas with them 2015, and they were just so warm and so loving and so joyful. And I remember the feeling of like, it was my first real experience of Christianity and Christians. They always seemed like the Christians that I had been told existed but had never met. Now, naturally, living in San Francisco in the Bay Area, that'll be more challenging. But it was like God had showed up in my life in a particular way to introduce me to what Christ is in the lives of people. It wasn't some big theological intrusion. That I think intrusion is not, intrusion. That was some big theological landing, behind the scenes parachuting kind of thing, like C.S. Lewis talks about. Yeah. It was more a personal connection. Like there was something about these people that was very different, and so that sort of planted a seed that would continue to grow over the coming years. So, but I had realized at that Burning Man trip that I was now free to pursue these dreams of travel that I had kind of kept on the back burner for 15 years. And so, now I'm single, and, I know who I am inside myself. I have a much greater sense of self-possession, and now I have this dream, and I have the means, praise God, and the opportunity and the motivation to fulfill it. And so I left the United States, bound to travel the world in March of 2016, carrying only a carry-on sized backpack, and a little shoulder sling, thinking I'd be gone, for maybe a year at the most, and it ended up being 4 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, so how did your spirituality change during that time?
Well, so there were two components to why I was traveling. One was I wanted adventure, like Indiana Jones, to get out there and do exciting things out there in the world. I ended up sailing, across the South Pacific and doing a mountain climbing class in the Himalayas and trekking through, wonderful parks in Chile, national parks in Chile and Patagonia. So I did all that adventurous stuff, and there was also a big component of spiritual seeking. I actually said to that therapist that I would see every Thursday, who was leading the men's group, the last time I met with him, I said, he said, "What are you looking for?" And I actually said out loud something I'd said to no one else: "I'm going looking for God." And so that was true. It sounds, slightly cringe to say, but I meant it very sincerely. And so how did my spirituality grow and change? Like, free of all the constraints of what's available in the Bay Area, I could throw myself into whatever New Age spiritual practices presented themselves to be, whether that be ayahuasca retreats in Peru, or much later a DMT retreat in Argentina, or sacred geometry meditations, sound healing, breath work,
Oh,
yoga. Like, oh yeah, man, if a spiritual opportunity, for a retreat came up and it was, near where I was going to be, or a place worth going, like, I did it. And so I visited many of the New Age enclaves around the world. Of course, I'd already been to Sedona. I visited Bali. I've been to Byron Bay. I've been to Koh Phangan, Thailand. I've been to Goa, India. So I went to all of the places. I went to Iquitos in Peru, and Pisac in the Sacred Valley, also in Peru. So, I intentionally looked for New Age spiritual retreats, all with the same worldview that I've talked about. Maybe there's some degree of having peak experiences. There's some amount of healing trauma or accessing deeply buried pain inside the self, and there's some amount of seeking spiritual revelation. And that was about 4 years.
did you ever feel fulfilled? Ever? With all the stuff that you were doing? Like, you're
Hmm.
talking about DMT, man. I know somebody who tried
Yeah,
that and they've never been the same, not in a good
yeah,
way. They
hmm,
are not good.
yeah.
And it's like you're talking about like these really spiritual things. And all I see in my head as you're saying this is like a hamster wheel. It's like, okay, you can stop for a little bit, but then you got to keep going.
Yeah.
Like, did you ever feel fulfillment?
Before I answer that question, because I want you to describe what you mean by fulfillment, because I want to make sure I answer precisely.
Of course you would ask that. I mean, like, this is it. I found it. I found God.
Hmm.
Did you ever feel that?
No, no. I was always, because the New Age doesn't believe in God.
You were on a
Well,
trip to find God, you know?
the thing, what I didn't realize is, I think this is one of the ways that probably my uh, upbringing in a Jewish household, and also God's hand on me, gave me a sense of God as a being that the New Age doesn't have. So I didn't realize that
Hmm.
this vision that I had of God in my mind didn't necessarily map to what I was experiencing. So I was seeking God as a being. But if you go into the New Age and read all the books and do all the things, you're not actually seeking God as a being. The New Age is more pantheist. All is God, or
Yep.
panentheist. All is in God. And I had this vision in my mind that God is a being that I can like pray and speak to. Maybe I didn't use the word God. Maybe sometimes I would say the universe, which is very popular. But I had this vision that struggled with my own practices. Like, it was like two parts of me were struggling. On one hand, God is an experience, right? God is a peak experience that you have. God consciousness, right? Christ consciousness in some circumstances, universal oneness, nirvana, all these, samadhi, right? That's the language that's used to describe not God, but an experience, which is not the same thing as God. So I was doing these practices that were ultimately seeking an all is one kind of experience, while at the same time, in my more sober moments, let's say, I still conceived of God as a being, but I had no way of understanding what God could be as a being.
Hmm.
Right? So it's
Mhm.
like, so I'm seeking, so what is God in a New Age worldview? Well, God is some universal mind, and your own limited consciousness is like taking a scoop of water out of the ocean, right? And your job as a seeker is to dissolve the cup so you return back into the universal mind. That's the goal. Or, you polish the cup so you have the best life now, right? And those are, by the way, the two conflicting streams of New Age mystical thought. Why spend all this money and time and energy developing your own individual cup if it doesn't really exist in the first place? Right.
Yeah.
But these are not things that people are thinking about. It's so, like, I would come to think about them later once I started asking questions. Once I got to the end of what I felt was like healing trauma. Once I had gotten so far
Yeah.
into that world and so proficient at it, I stopped caring about digging for whatever next traumatic thing supposedly happened. I said, okay, now I'm going to start actually seeking spiritual truth, because I had gotten past myself. I'd gotten over myself. And so now I can begin investigating these things, with a more sincere mind. And that's when the cracks started to show up. Once you do all the trauma healing and you get to the bottom of that barrel, it's like, okay, well, I could, am I going to dig again? Or is this trauma healing? Is this getting boring now?
Yes.
And that's kind of what happened. So it does get boring.
Yeah.
And so then it's like, so once I start examining the room that I'm in, it's like, wait, I didn't notice that crack on the wall. I didn't notice that it's leaking over there.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what's happening.
It's like you're as good as it gets, right? And once you realize that, you're like, oh, ugh, it's not as like profound. Now, okay, so something else that's interesting is as I'm hearing you talk, sometimes the older we're getting, right? We're not old, okay? We're not like super old or anything, but it's like once you see somebody go through something that you went through that you thought was so profound at first, and now you're looking back at it and you're like, oh, yeah, I've been there. I've been through that. It's not what you think, right?
Mhm.
Whatever it is. But to them, it's brand new. It's
Yeah.
new information that's been hidden from them. And it's profound. And it's just every generation. It's like you got to stop the same nonsense. And I imagine as I imagine this as you're telling your story, you mentioned psychedelics.
Mhm.
And before we got on, we were talking about who was it? The name of
Brian Johnson.
who was it?
Brian Johnson.
Brian Johnson. Yeah, he made this Twitter post. I'm sorry, it'll always be Twitter to me. Post about his experience with DMT,
Mhm.
and I could not help but be just I kind of rolled my eyes a little bit. I'm like, you sound like everybody else. Everybody else thinks that, oh, this is it. I found this profound spiritual experience. My life's never going to be the same. And I was wondering, number one, your general thoughts on what I'm saying, as far as when you see somebody talking about psychedelics or any of the stuff, because it sounds like you've done it all. Like
I have.
you're one of the only people I think I know, ex-New Ager, who's like, yeah, I've done that. I've done that. I've done that. But it's like whenever you see that, what do you think about it? And what would you say to him if he were in front of you?
Hmm. Yeah, there's a couple. This gets to a couple questions that I have thought through quite a bit. So, what would I say to him? My general posture towards a lot of these practices is not even once, because of the "it works" trap.
Hey.
The idea.
Yeah.
That's right. That's right.
I
Right.
dubbed that.
There you go. So, because it's like you may experience the first time that you do a psychedelic drug a feeling of universal oneness consciousness. No, they say there's nothing like your first time. And then everything after that will be chasing that again.
Yes.
Oh, I just need to do it again and I'll get back to that point. Oh, I went to this breathwork meditation session and I just felt this really great peace, right? Yeah. Like you're now in the "it works" trap.
You're in a toxic relationship, my friend. That's what you're in. Yeah.
That's right. That's right. And so I tell people not even once, don't go looking down this road. The answers are far simpler and but not easy.
Yes.
But they're far better. That's one. The other is, what would I say to him? The challenge with evangelizing to people who are in the New Age is that people come into the New Age for all different reasons. There's no one single, like someone decides they want to convert and become, I don't know, they want to become a Buddhist. That's rare that anyone actually becomes a Buddhist, right? Buddhism and Hinduism are at the core of a lot of New Age thinking, but then a lot of New Age people will say that they're a Buddhist if you ask them. But no one is actually like, they're doing the Sangha, the Sangha, they're in their meditation group, they don't believe in the Dharma, like they've probably never read Buddhist teachings, right? They've gotten them secondhand, laundered through a lot of New Age writers, because they're looking for something that they're not aware of. And so what would I say to Brian Johnson? I would need to understand what it is he's really seeking. And what Brian Johnson is seeking, he's honest about this, is he's seeking transcendence. He's seeking physical transcendence. His whole deal is he's through science and technology is never going to die. right? That's his whole gig. And so his approach, before he took DMT, he took mushrooms. And that was a whole big thing. He took mushrooms. He was on a live stream and everyone was watching him high on mushrooms for however long.
Are you serious?
Oh yeah. Yeah, the DMT trip, he was on camera too. It was like an hour-long live stream he did.
Okay, back up a second. Oh, I know
Okay.
this guy. Hold on. Brian
Yeah.
Johnson. All right, he has almost 1 million followers on X. Conquering death will be humanity's greatest achievement. Doesn't he have a YouTube channel where he's just obsessed with health?
Probably. Yeah.
I'm trying to the Netflix documentary. Okay, I've seen him before. I'm finding his post that he made so I can read it so everybody has the context to what we're saying. Don't go on X, guys. It's a cesspool. Everything they say about it is true. Don't go on there. But let me read this to you real quick. So this was on March 22nd, 2026. This is what he says. This was the most profound experience of my life. I am stunned beyond comprehension. This molecule is without peer. The 27 milligram dose opened up what felt like pure consciousness and intelligence, a majestic reveal of existence itself and all its incomprehensible glory and majesty. I mean, he was just talking. It was like poetic.
Yeah, he's all the way in it.
Yeah, he's in it. It's impossible to explain with words. Whatever you imagine, multiply it by 1,000, and then add infinite depth or width and depth and dimensions. But entrance was not granted without prerequisite. He's a good writer. I'll give him that. Existence demanded that I submit, that I say yes without attachment, without condition, yes to existence, yes to dissolution of self, yes to release control, yes to all. My ego resisted. I may not read the whole thing. Oh, no, it's not that long. Okay. My ego resisted. My ego registered the ask and panicked. It wanted control. It was desperate for control. It pleaded to escape from the torrent of light and essence that threatened to rip my sanity into shards. Wow. The urge to eject was overwhelming. Terror thundered throughout my mind and body. It took everything within me to release. I overcame and was treated with bliss that defies imagination. A euphoria colored with perfect harmony of all things, an orchestra of essence washed over me and swept me up in dance. It was home, the highest aspiration of intelligent life, for some reason stored and tucked away as the ultimate prize. A single concept emerged in omnipresence. We cannot grok the preciousness of our existence. Yet it is everything we've ever wanted and more. I can't wait to get your thoughts on this. Okay. The state we long for without knowing it exists, it caused me great pain and heartache. A swell of loyalty and devotion emerged inside me, pledging allegiance to existence, to become a warrior and caretaker of life on earth, to protect at any cost the candle of consciousness that has miraculously emerged in this part of the galaxy. What awaits will wipe all your tears, soothe all your sorrows, and infinitely exceed your wants. And this is because he took DMT.
He smoked DMT.
Tell me your thoughts about this that he just said.
Well, remember what I said a minute ago about how in the New Age, God is...
Yeah.
Right. Well, God is not a being. Yeah. God is an experience. And so that's what he's talking about. This is a version of the it works trap. I have just had this transcendent experience of blissful oneness, omnipresence, I think is the word that he used. Yeah. Every tear will be wiped away, euphoria, right? And he's using language, the divine. This is language that there is this, I don't know that he used the word universal consciousness, but he pointed to it, to become a warrior, right? So you have this image of like being charged with this universal, it's sent on a mission for this universal consciousness, right? So you're having this experience that now you're going to go out and you're going to evangelize this experience, not a being. He reflected no knowledge of a being, who this being is or what, just a consciousness, a mind, and his experience of it. And now he talks about being an evangelist for it. And so that's exactly what I was talking about. That is the peak experience that people inside the New Age go chasing, primarily on psychedelics. And DMT is the most powerful version of DMT on Earth is called 5-MeO-DMT, and it's one of the ways to get it is secreted from the Sonoran desert toad called Bufo alvarius, and that's the version that I've done. That was the retreat in 2019. Okay. Was smoked Bufo alvarius twice, and my experience was slightly different from his. So
did it scare you? Did you have a bad trip?
Yeah, yeah, I'll just tell you. So, the trip was over 2 days. There was like a Friday and a Saturday. On Friday, um, it was the men would go smoke with a male facilitator one-on-one in this grove of trees. So every man would go out to be with the male facilitator, and then on Saturday was everyone in a group together inside this retreat center, this like a cabin essentially. So the first day on Friday, I wanted to go smoke with a male facilitator. I took the hit and I proceeded to black out completely. I have no memory of what happened. I opened my eyes and I was looking up at the trees and slowly kind of regained consciousness. And I realized that I was lying on my back. And I look up and I look around, and the facilitator is walking away into the grove of trees, where he then proceeds to like kneel down and lift up his arms to the light. And I'm like, okay, whatever. So I get up, I stand up wobbly, and I start walking back to the retreat center where everyone else is. And as I'm walking up, I realize that like, well, I feel something on my face. I pull up this little leaf or something like this, and like, what? I've got like this taste of dirt in my mouth. And as I'm walking up, everyone's looking at me and they're all smiling, and their faces go, Will. I'm like, what? And they're like, go look in the mirror. And so I went and I looked in the mirror, and my face was all bashed up, bleeding, right? Covered in dirt and leaves and stuff. My face was numb, right? And so I go to find out what happened. So I go to talk to the facilitator, and according to the facilitator, he told me that I had turned feral. I started like digging in the dirt and making all these animal noises and roaring like a lion or an animal or something like that. And he saw me doing that. He was letting me do it, but then he started to get worried that I would get dirt which would clog my airways and I would choke to death. Yeah. So then he had to grab me, and he was shorter than me, but he was stronger than me. He was a big guy, looked like he was into jujitsu or something. So he had to put me in a submission hold on my back. He had his arms wrapped around my shoulders, so my arms were splayed out to the side and like kind of like a half Nelson hold. Yeah. And he was picking dirt out of my lips and out of my nose so that I could breathe. I have no memory of any of this. And so, so that was day one. And I have photos actually.
Wow.
And so not of the whole experience, but what I looked like afterwards. Perhaps I could bring those up when we're done. But so the second day comes around where we're all going to smoke together. At this point, I have a black eye and my face is all scuffed up, and it's now on Saturday, and we get together in the circle, and I'm like, should I try again? Lightning can't possibly strike twice. So like, okay, that didn't go well, but let's try again. Like I said, hey, look, I have never through any of this claimed to be intelligent or thoughtful or well-reasoned, but I was like, when am I going to be?
Your friends like, no, don't do it.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And so, go traveling back in time. So pipe comes around, I take the pipe, and and so just real quick for those who don't know, you can't actually hold the pipe on your own, because when you inhale the DMT, it starts acting so quickly that you're liable to drop it. So someone has to give the pipe to you and light it, and you just inhale. So the facilitator again comes up. No one had any problem with giving it to me. No one's like, hey, maybe you should sit this one out. They were totally open to me doing it again, right? So it's like, again, if you have no ability to say right and wrong, this is bad. It's like, if I say yes, that's all that they need, right? And so again, it's on me, but just to say that there's no values in some of these communities in really essential ways. And so the pipe comes around, I take it again. This time, and everything that I'm about to say is 100% true. This time, my whole world explodes in flame, explodes in fire, like a giant wall of fire shoots up all around me. This is all within my own subjective consciousness. Ropes, it feels, get attached to my wrists and pulled behind me, right? And so I'm bent back with my neck stretched out.
Yeah. And
I'm feeling the most intense pain and fear that I've ever felt. And I hear one little phrase. It says, trust God. And so then whatever's going on pulls harder and causes even more pain. And then the voice says even louder, trust God. And then just pure excruciating agony. I'm so I have no idea what's going on. I'm just reacting second. Like there's no thought what's going on. All I hear is a voice screaming, trust God. And so I just feel inside myself that I trust God. And then the vision ends. And then suddenly I'm standing on a cliffside and I'm overlooking this. It's like I'm standing on the edge of the cliff and I'm looking over this valley, and the valley is all of this surging energy, just waves of surging energy. And there's voices, individuals, beings that I can't see that are all around me. They're standing all around. I can't really see them. I can kind of make out shapes. And they're all going, jump, 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 jump. They're all cheering me on, clapping, drumming, like there's dozens of them. Jump, 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 jump off for the intention for me to jump off into the sea of surging energy. But behind me is this old withered tree. And so all these spirits or whatever are telling me to jump. It's like drumming and banging, and I'm looking over and I have to jump. And this feels like this big climactic moment of my whole life, but this tree is right behind me. And so then I turn around and I grab hold of the tree, and they're yelling, jump, jump, jump. And I have the sense inside me that the moment is passing. I have to make a decision really, really quickly. And I hold onto the tree and I just say, no, I'm not going to jump. I think in the moment I felt like, oh, maybe I'm chickening out, but like I have to hold on. I'm not listening to them. And so all the spirits, then the moment passes, all the spirits depart. And one of them seems to say, I'm so disappointed in you. And then I splash down in the next vision, next phrase of it, next frame of it. I splash down into this dark room with one, like a trap door overhead, right? And I'm face down, and it's like in stomach acid and vomit and stuff like that. I'm just kind of face down in this pool. I'm just like feeling it get into my mouth, like, oh, what's going on? And then that's where the vision kind of ends, and I open my eyes, and my girlfriend's there, and she's like looking at me like, Will, are you okay? Are you okay? And I'm seeing all this chaos around me, right? Just people like dancing and screaming and shouting and all this stuff. And I'm looking around, and I'm like, this must be hell, right? This must be hell. And I think, I wonder if it's going to hurt to go crazy. Because I imagine an eternity in this environment. I wonder if it's going to hurt to go crazy. And then a little voice says to me, or maybe you're just on drugs. And that's when it kind of breaks and I come to. And so after that, I discover that what had happened from everyone else's subjective opinion is that I had face planted face down onto the hard. I was sitting on a mattress. Yeah. I face planted face down onto the hardwood floor of the cabin and got a second black eye. So my face is all banged up, scuffed, scarred, bruised, 2 black eyes. Went to the airport to get on a plane a couple days later, and someone said I looked like I'd been in a car accident.
All of that from trying DMT?
Mm-hmm. That was the last time I ever took a psychedelic drug.
Okay, looking back now, what do you think reflecting on that, number one? And number two, did this do anything for your spiritual life? Because some people try this stuff and they're just never the same again.
Oh, no. Did it do anything for my spiritual life in terms of like, did I try to do more?
Did it give you any answers or satisfaction? Or did you leave thinking, wow, that was amazing? Or like, what was your impression of it as you were leaving?
No, I was super rattled.
Okay.
I mean, that opening vision where whatever voice is telling me to trust God, that was more pain than I've ever felt in my entire life. Wow. I hope to never feel pain like that again. Like something was trying to break my body. The voice of trust God was intruding on the experience to give me hope. Now, trusting God was an idea that I had already had somehow that was in me. This is what I mean when I reflect on my testimony and say that God showed up for me in ways, that I'm not even aware of when I didn't even know him. Whatever I was hearing in that moment, that's what that voice was pointing to, was the God of the Bible, the God of Scripture, not like trust this oceanic oneness experience. It was like trust that there's a being out there that loves and cares for you, that's got you. That's what it was trying to communicate. That's what I took from it in this moment where I'm completely powerless and at the mercy of whatever's going on. Like it was very, very real. There was no time for me to process what was going on with me. And then as I thought about it later, the symbolism that didn't make sense to me at the time, but makes sense now, is grabbing onto the tree.
Yeah.
Right, the old withered brown tree. instead of jumping off the cliff that all these spirits were encouraging me to do. To date, I don't know what would have happened if I would have. I'd shudder to think about it.
Yeah.
And it was very clear that because I failed to jump, the third part of the vision was me being punished. It was me being punished for failure. And so I walked away with this feeling from this trip. This is in 2019. I would become a Christian about a year later. I wouldn't reflect on the trip for a little bit after that, but I had clearly let someone or something down in the spiritual realm, and I was being punished for it. And the vision left me with some feelings and impressions and sounds that just communicated this deep spiritual disappointment that someone or something had in me. And so what was I? No, I was not interested in doing psychedelics or drugs anymore after that. I never pursued it again. And I never took a drug again. And I'd become a Christian a year later, and then it became impossible, like in a really good way. But that was the beginning of the end of my spiritual journey, because through the New Age, because it was also at that retreat that I had begun reflecting on. I had been through India. So we skipped over a whole bunch, but we'll just end, sort of maybe talking about the travels. Up to you, but that was coming at the back end of 7 months of traveling through India and Nepal.
Mm-hmm.
So you can think of my travels up until that point as preparing to backpack through India alone. India is the place of global travelers that breaks travelers, because they're just not prepared for how India it is, for the noise and the pollution and the poverty and the filth and all of that. They're just not prepared for it. They're like, I'm going to this land of great spiritual enlightenment. And then they get deeply disillusioned. They don't know what to do with it. And they come back hating the world and hating India. And I was like, okay, I'm going to train in my own travels for a couple years to be prepared to really see India for real. So I know, so I'm aware of my environment. So I know how to navigate. I don't have to show uncertainty. I know what I'm going to do. So I can really see this place for myself. And that was deeply disillusioning, because I saw that the center of New Age beliefs is Hinduism. And what does Hinduism produce in India?
Mm-hmm.
Nothing very good. In fact, what does Hinduism produce in Western seekers in India? Nothing good. I went to, I'm not joking, because I went to the Kumbh Mela Hindu Festival in 2019. 200 million Hindus bathing in the Ganges River, not all at once, like 50 million on the single largest day. But like this is the biggest. This is the festival that Yogananda talks about in Autobiography of a Yogi, that central New Age book that Steve Jobs gave away at his funeral. He had that book given away, and so I went to the center of Hinduism,
wow.
right? Which is and so I saw. I went to Varanasi. I went to the Arti, the blessing of the river in Varanasi. Varanasi is a wonderful city, but it's absolutely filthy, But it is what it is, and you see what Hinduism produces in Indian society, right? And so I went looking. I was very sincere, and so at the end of 7 months in India and Nepal, I was left with some moral questions, namely that if all is one, then can we say there's any difference between good and evil, right? If all is one,
Yeah.
then what I'm looking at can't possibly be evil, because it's God.
Yep.
So evil is God. That didn't make any sense to me, and that crystallized for me when I learned about Jeffrey Epstein and child sex trafficking, which I've spoken about before.
Mm-hmm.
It was that you're telling me that someone who kidnaps a child for the purposes of sexually assaulting them and selling them, you're telling me that that's God? I'm sorry, I can't get down with that. That's morally repulsive. And the thing is I couldn't find anyone who would talk to me about it. No one would engage me in conversation about that. And it was at that retreat, that DMT retreat, that here are serious seekers that are doing the thing, the chief New Age sacrament, the most intense one that you can do. Here are spiritual seekers that they won't talk about it. And so that really troubled me. And so I came back to the United States in early 2020, having this unanswered question about the nature of evil, having had this spiritual experience where I felt at the time that I had failed, and then I was being punished. I was subjected to intense torment, really, and then I failed, and then I was punished, right? And so what am I going to do with that? And then I come back to the United States in February 2020, and then COVID happens. And I'm looking around, at all this spreading, and I'm like, coming from the New Age world, generally pretty good on holistic health stuff, and I know nothing good is going to come from this. And so it was in that kind of milieu that I'm sitting with these unanswered questions. Here's evil spreading, these lockdowns, which just felt really wrong, and they were really wrong. And here's this spiritual experience of being punished, and here's this unanswered question about evil. And that is precisely when Christ showed up for me in the book Simply Christian by N.T. Wright. It was in that book, N.T. Wright is writing, and this was given to me by my friends at Burning Man who had kept in touch with. I went to go visit them for Christmas, and I was in touch with them the entire time while I was traveling, and they were praying like crazy for me, and they didn't even know why. I would check in from time to time with them, and they were just like, they would tell me that we felt at the time that we just had to pray for you, and we were all praying for you. And I didn't know that, but it was Rob, the leader of Camp Spirit Dream, one of the leaders, who gave me the book Simply Christian. In fact, he shipped it to a friend of mine. That friend came and picked me up from the airport. And so the night that I arrived back in America after 4 years, Simply Christian was put in my hands. Exactly. And then as I'm staying at my dad's place until I can get an apartment, I'm reading Simply Christian. And N.T. Wright writes, he says, Christ was up on the cross, and this big wave of evil was coming to crash over him, and through his death and sacrifice and resurrection, he drove back the wave of evil forever. And something clicked. I was like, it clicked. And so that was when I started more seriously exploring Christianity. And so then I read C.S. Lewis. The only book about Christianity I knew was Mere Christianity. And then I knew about the Screwtape Letters. And so that was what I was doing during 2020.
So you've been searching everywhere for 4 years, a spiritual search.
20 years.
Did it feel like, the way that I put it, it's like my soul took a breath for the first time, right? Kind of this, oh, this is it, how was it different compared to all of the other spiritual journeys that you've been on to read about Christ, about Jesus, about the gospel?
It was like getting real answers for the first time. Real clear answers for the first time. It wasn't you just meditate until you have the experience, or take the drug until you feel the thing, or breathe out the trauma so you feel the oceanic bliss of oneness. It wasn't chasing a fleeting experience. It was clear. It was crystal clear. It was defined. In fact, I remember when I read Mere Christianity, I thought that C.S. Lewis was doing the impossible. I had always been told you could never reason your way to faith. And that's what C.S. Lewis is doing in Mere Christianity. He's reasoning his way to the Christian faith. From the New Age world, that's impossible. You can't reason your way to faith. You have to have an experience, bro. You just have to feel it. It's like, you can't just reason your way there. But here C.S. Lewis is doing it. And he's providing moral answers. He's saying to me, good and evil are real things. Like, it is a real thing. Evil is never, it's never in balance. It's never like yin and yang, right? Good always has the upper hand, but like evil is real. And so it was like hearing, this is a real thing with its own existence that is active, and Christianity has something to say directly in response to it. It's not, evil is an illusion cultivated by your subjective mind, and you have to undo your subjective mind to see the objective truth that all is one and there is no good and evil. It wasn't that at all. Evil is real. Christ triumphed over it. And it was saying everything you're seeing in the world, Will, that you've seen over 20 years of seeking and 4 years of travel, going to India and third world countries and seeing all this different stuff and all the conspiracy stuff that I'd studied as well, evil is real. And Christ has something to say in response to it, and he defeated it. And that was just like, I had never seen anything like that, because there is nothing else like that on Earth.
It's like the end game. He's just what everybody's looking for. And okay, so that was it for you. And you gave your life to Christ, as they say. And that was it for you. But then you hit a few bumps.
Yeah.
Tell us about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think in the very early days of when I was a Christian, probably the first couple years before I really started exploring theology, which started to happen in summer of 2022. Again, this is during COVID, so a
Yeah.
lot of churches are closed, and I didn't know what to do next. I just knew that I knew when I became a Christian, I knew three things. Because, like, what do Christians do? Christians forgive people, and they go to church, and they pray on their knees on their bed every night before they go to
Oh, you're
sleep.
such a baby Christian at that time. That's
That,
such a
like,
baby Christian thing.
completely,
Yeah.
completely. But so it's like that's where I started, right? So it's like, okay, well, I'll say the Lord's Prayer because I knew the Lord's Prayer
Yeah.
on my knees at the foot of the bed. But it was hard to find churches that were open,
Yeah.
and so I didn't really know where to begin. I think at the time, particularly early on, I had this belief that all paths are equal ways up the mountain, but only Christianity will get you the rest of the way.
Mm.
And so there was a really defined moment, I would say probably 2021, something like that, where I realized, like, no, all these other paths are false. They're all lies. They're all demonic, or they're all delusions. And Christ is the only way, and he's ever only been the only way. And that was a real moment for me as I had to grapple with the reality of hell and the reality of election and damnation and all of that. And that was a real struggle within myself. And I also went through an experience of, over those first couple years, of not just I lost many friends who I'd become close with during my time in the manosphere, pagan kind of secular guys, and as I was becoming more and more Christian, they liked me less and less, and so there was a big fallout that happened with me and some of my close friends, sort of like things arranged behind the scenes that impacted me in negative ways, and I was just kind of left to deal with it. Let's put it that way.
Mm-hmm.
And then also I was rejected by my family. My family found out that I had become a Christian. I had started a podcast at that point. I was talking about it. So it didn't surprise me that they knew. But a couple members of my family, my mom's side, staged basically an intervention where they invited me over. I was Thanksgiving weekend 2022, I believe. And I hadn't seen them in a couple years. They invited me to Thanksgiving last minute, so I thought they just put it together last minute. But there were family members from out of town that were there, and so I was just the late addition. And then I was invited over the following Sunday quite urgently. I hadn't seen them in 2 years, and suddenly it's urgent that I come over. And during that, they kind of staged an intervention and confronted me about becoming a Christian. And one of my family members called me forgive me the swearing, batshit crazy. And I haven't spoken to them really since. I'm not part of the family anymore. I'm not invited to Thanksgiving, or I'm the oldest son of the family, and I'm not part of them anymore. But praise God, through all of that, my dad and I have only grown closer. My dad showed up to, I believe it was my birthday. We got together for my birthday, I think in early 2021, maybe it was early 2022. And he said, he showed up with a Bible and a book about the Old Testament, and he said, "You'll always be my son." And my dad and I have only grown closer, and so it's been such a blessing to share that with him. And of course, I got married this past July, and that was wonderful. And he was there, and he's been so happy for me and my wife, who's also pregnant and due very soon. Perhaps even by the time this comes out, the baby might have been born, our son. And so I've been very grateful to get closer with my dad, but in the process, I've lost a lot of people along the way.
Yeah, I'm sorry to hear that. It's I don't understand that, though, how you could have been in this really, really dark place for all these years, and there's no intervention for that, right? For all the
Right.
other things that you were doing that were actually harmful for you, and then you give it up and
I think it has been. I think what's been tough about it, well, I mean, but that's what Christ talks about. I come not to bring peace, but a sword. It's part of following him. Is not everyone's going to be part of that journey, and that's okay. And I think the thing that was hard is that it was never, "Hey, we just want to make sure that you're okay. Have you joined a cult?"
Yeah, I can understand that.
Yeah.
There are cults out there, yeah, for sure.
Yeah, but I went over, like I said, I went over to Thanksgiving that year, and I never made my faith an issue. I didn't even talk about it, but no one was talking to me. The only person who was talking to me that entire thing is super weird. The only person who was talking to me was my cousin's new boyfriend, who didn't get the memo. No one else was really talking to me, and so it was sort of like my life choices became something that they did not like, and it had nothing to do with them because I was never going to bring it up. I didn't think it was any of their business, at least not at that stage in my faith. But it was a challenge for them. But that's not unusual. That's an experience that many believers have from many different cultural backgrounds around the world, not just Jewish. In fact, there's in China, in mainland China, if people become Christian, they're asked, like, "Are you eating potato?" And that's the phrase that means, because in China the staple carbohydrate is rice, and so if you eat potato, then you're European. Are you eating potato? And so it is a thing that cultures around the world, once people become Christian, their family members and friends feel that something significant has shifted about them. They feel it intuitively, even if they can't say what it is. And of course, it is the aroma of death for those who are perishing, and the aroma of life who those who are alive. Pardon I butcher that, but I think that's a big part of it. And so, I still pray for my family members that they find the peace and the things that I have as well.
Amen to that. Yeah. So there's I would say that I want to say that part 2 to your story is actually the other video that we did, because there's a whole other side to
Yeah.
to after Will became a Christian that we do cover in the Woke Right video, because you got involved in that area, and we won't rehash it here, but it's very interesting. I'm glad that we had a video devoted to just your story, because then it kind of sets the scene into how you got into a lot of the stuff that you got into, that a lot of Christian men in particular are hung up on. To back it up, though, a little bit. So you mentioned Burning Man. You and I have a mutual friend, Carl Tykrib. I saw you grab his book before we got on. Is there something you want to share or read from his book? I would love to hear this.
And this showed up when I did the podcast interview with him, where he does a passage about what does he call it? It's not spiritual man. It's a whole thing.
Here, I have the book here too. Let me. I interviewed Carl on my channel, for those of you who are wondering, about Burning Man and about Freemasonry. So I will leave that in the description to find out.
Yeah. And real quick, I want to key off something you said. Sure. Yes, this does play very much into my story that we talked about in the other video, because there were things that I was sanctified of very privately. Perhaps my all is one, all religions equal paths up the mountain, even while I had a podcast, that I was sanctified of just in private. But as a public person, there were things that I needed to be sanctified of publicly. And it was a lot of my conspiratorial thinking, particularly with exposure to like the whole role of the Jews in the world and stuff like that I had been marinating in various ways for a decade at that point, perhaps a little bit less. 2013 is when I got deep into the conspiracy stuff, but I remember watching like Loose Change and Zeitgeist and stuff like that in the early 2000s after 9/11. So I was publicly sanctified of all of that. It was a very difficult experience, but of course, praise God, it's borne a lot of fruit. But yeah, you're absolutely right that, there are a lot of beliefs that I didn't examine that I carried with me forward that I had to be sanctified of. And I think that's part of the life of any believer, and that, there are ideas that we carry into our Christian life that fall away very slowly and sometimes fall away very quickly. And so I'm grateful that I've gotten the chance to talk about that other aspect of what happened after I became a Christian in more depth on our previous conversation.
In God's providence, let me just tell you, from somebody that's on the receiving end of understanding what this whole conspiratorial woke right stuff is, the Jewish conspiracies, I'm glad. I know this is going to sound weird, but I know you'll get it. I'm glad you went through that.
Me too.
Okay. Yeah, because I'm like, oh, thank God, because I need some tools to understand what's happening. And I'm so grateful that God used you in that way and kind of let you go through the fire, because so many of us now can understand what that is because you went through that. So, yeah.
Thank you. I know it means a lot. And, I've spent a lot of time reflecting on my story and my testimony and trying to understand, that mysterious overlap between, God's sovereignty and our free will, like where is it that I'm being sinful? Where is it I'm being allowed? Where is it God writing the story? Like, I don't know how to talk about all that. I don't think anybody does, but what I do know is that, I regard my life as the choices that I made that God is giving me the chance to redeem. That I had the unique experience to venture into some truly dangerous physical situations and genuinely dangerous spiritual situations. Kabbalah, is very, very dark. Kabbalah, Kundalini, that's, Advaita Vedanta, like those things are at the very bottom of the mystical rabbit hole. The ability to work your own will in reality, to commune with spirits, to do magic, so to speak. That's at the very bottom of the rabbit hole. And I got to travel all the way down to the bottom of that, and I got yanked out of it. I got to see just enough of it. And then, to the DMT experience, and then of course, I've done 15 ayahuasca ceremonies, which we didn't quite get to, but perhaps for another time, talking about ayahuasca is like DMT is more about seeking transcendence. Ayahuasca is positioned as a psychological healing modality about healing trauma and finding your truth. That's what it essentially is. And so it's psychology or psychotherapy by chemical means. And so that's how it's positioned. But again, it gets to the same relativism. What are you changing yourself into?
Yes.
If you have the opportunity to rewire yourself or commune with Mama Ayahuasca or her plant spirit helpers to rewire yourself at the deepest level or implant desires or visions or change yourself, what direction are you changing yourself in? Ayahuasca gives you will put you in a state of mind to do that quite a bit more easily than just through talk therapy. It's like a chemically induced, hyper spiritualized, sorcery, so divination and sorcery way to do that same thing. But what are the values? What are you being conformed to? Well, you're not being conformed to Christ because you don't need ayahuasca for that. So that's that's kind of what's going on with a lot of that world is, hey, I'm disillusioned with my life, so let me change my life. So I'm going to drink this drug and I'm going to commune with these spirits and they're going to show me truths about myself, Gnostic truths about myself. And together we're going to plot a new course for my life. And I'm just going to go change and run off in this direction and become a traveling circus performer. That happens. Quit my job, become a yoga instructor. It's very common. Yeah. And that's, we talked a little bit about that. Ayahuasca is just a chemical earth medicine way of doing it.
Yeah, your experience sounds very different than Brian Johnson's. Oh, which by the way, I did look this up on why he sounded so familiar. I saw him on YouTube because the reason why he's famous is that he has this Project Blueprint. His goal is to reverse his biological age.
Yes, he's trying to live forever.
Yes, he wants to live forever. And so there's, I remember watching a video about this regimen, this food regimen that he was. So that's what Brian Johnson is known for.
Yeah, quickly, just his purpose for taking DMT. There's the same reason he wanted to take mushrooms. Is that I believe he said that through taking psychedelic drugs, he can lengthen the telomeres on his DNA strands, and telomeres is like I believe that's the aging component of our DNA, so our telomeres get shorter, and that's aging. And so he believes, I think, if you can reverse the shrinking telomeres, you can extend them, and then you can live forever. So that's the focused aspect of what he's trying to do, is reverse the aging process by lengthening the telomeres. That's what he said about mushrooms, and I believe that's why he did DMT as well, because science is saying that you can, through using psychedelics, you can lengthen telomeres. So that was his initial purpose of taking it. But he discovered, as I think he's discovered, that he got far more than he bargained for. And so I imagine we're going to see quite a big shift in a lot of the things that he's talking about following the back half of that post, as he doubles down. And I feel for the man, and I would tell him there's a much better way to live forever in a resurrected body here on earth.
I was just going to say, I'm like, who wants to tell him, right? Like, you're going to die someday, my guy. Yeah. You're going to die. We're all going to die. And it's like the fountain of youth that he's looking for is not what he thinks it is. And it sounds too exhausting. That just sounds so exhausting. But I'm going to keep a lookout for the things that he posts from this point on, because it does make me wonder. I hope he does what you did, where he just tries it all and he's like, oh, there's nothing at the bottom of this well, and he runs into Jesus. That would be amazing.
Yeah, but I would pray for the repentance, which I'm sure would be quite a significant process for him to go through, humbling in all the right ways. And of course, submitting to that is quite difficult. It's far easier to submit your consciousness to an all is one reality, which he seemed to be suggesting. It's far more difficult to submit to the creator of the universe and to us being creatures. And God gets to tell us how to live, including the things we have to say no to and the things we have to say yes to, and recognizing that we've lived lives that are completely in opposition to that, in my case, is a very difficult process, but that way lies true eternal life with God. And so I pray that he finds that path as well.
Amen to that. Okay, so now with Carl's book, what do you
Oh,
got
yeah.
for us? Yeah.
So I love Carl Teichert for many reasons, but one is obviously his book, Game of Gods, which we talked about. And I was reading this book and I was loving it because he was describing from the outside many things that I had experienced from the inside. And I got to page 396 and he wrote this passage about perennial man. And it's a description of a particular kind of guy. And I read this and it was like looking into a mirror. And so I'd like to read perennial man, this passage to you. It's just it's most of the page of 396, if I may.
Okay, sure. Go ahead. I'm going to read along with you.
Okay. Exaggerating for effort, let me introduce you to perennial man. After morning yoga, perennial man immerses himself in the teachings of Ken Wilber and Christian mystic Richard Rohr, self-owning Wilber's integral theory and the flow of Rohr's cosmic Christ. Globe-trotting, he ventures as a holy nomad and loses himself in ecstatic dance on the beaches of Goa, and in Oroville, which I've been to, he discovers intentional community before traveling to Australia for the Rainbow Serpent Festival. Tripping into the jungles of Brazil, he encounters the plant spirit during an ayahuasca journey. Going to the Theosophical Society headquarters in Wheaton, Illinois, he attends lectures on sacred art and discussions on Advaita philosophy. And in the quiet of the evening, he contemplates inner divinity during a prayer walk in the labyrinth tucked along the west side of the grounds. In Toronto, he spins awake his mystic heart with Sufi masters, then disappears for a 2-week encounter with shamans in Oregon before going to Burning Man in Nevada. Returning home, he joins a Unitarian Universalist church and celebrates the sacred harvest with its Wiccan members. He cleanses his house of negative energy with crystals purchased at the Wellness Expo and handles workplace stress with transcendental meditation. Back pain is managed through Reiki, and the future is guided by tarot cards and astrology. In traditional Christianity, this was rejected as a teenager in Sunday school and mocked in university. Perennial man is spiritual but not religious. I read that.
Good. That's satirical. That's so good.
When I read that, I'm like, that is uncomfortable portrayal of the exact man that I was. I haven't done a lot of those things, but I've done many of my own versions of it. And so Carl and I had a great moment on my podcast where I read that to him, and it was a moment of celebration because he was writing this book for me without really knowing me.
That's a really good way to put it. That's awesome. I've read parts of his book and I've used some of it in my own. He peer reviewed, I think, 2 of my chapters, but I've never read that excerpt before. That is you. That's you in a paragraph.
It is.
Yeah.
It is. Praise God.
So praise God. I'm so glad I finally got you on my channel to tell your story. I mean, I knew it was going to be long. I knew it was going to be, thorough and interesting. And guys, I can't tell you how much information is probably on Will's channel. He has the Will Spencer podcast. What is the name of your podcast?
It's the Will Spencer podcast.
It's just your name. Okay, yeah,
It's
the Will Spencer. Because I think of Run of Men. But that is your name on Twitter. So I'll leave a link in the description to all the information that you can find on his stuff. He has a variety of information on his channel. I highly encourage you to check it out. Will, before we sign off, is there anything that you want to add to our conversation that maybe we didn't get to, or just a closing note?
Yeah, I think we've covered it all. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to give my testimony. Obviously, there are some sections that we can dive much deeper into. Like I said, ayahuasca and sacred geometry and India and the Kumbh Mela Festival and all of that. I think the thing that I want to leave people with is, I've put a lot of my perspectives on the New Age and how to crack the worldview into a new course that I'm releasing. It's called Exiting the New Age. And I put this course together. It's a seminar that I recorded in 2023 that was intended to be like a heat-seeking missile to the heart of the New Age worldview, where I explain what it is in terms that aren't supposed to be possible. So the New Age is famous for not being able to define what it is. That is actually a definition of it, that it's amorphous, syncretic, works evidence-based, non-scriptural, and non-theistic. And so these are 5 characteristics of the New Age. And so I designed the presentation to confront the New Age with the message of Christ throughout a 2.5 hour course. And I'm very excited to be putting that out. And you can find that at willspencer.co/exit. And it's intended both for people who are inside to lead them out, to help give them God's truth from a man who has walked that road. I talk about some of my other experiences that we didn't get into in this conversation, but it's also designed to equip pastors and faith leaders to understand the New Age from the outside, looking in a way that sets them up to minister to people and what they may be seeking. So that's my Exiting the New Age course. That's at willspencer.co/exit.
Also, you have a Substack
Mm-hmm.
that you do. What is it called? I want to say like a book club, but right now you're doing Black Sun.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So I do the Will Spencer book club. I think I have it right down here. Hold on, let me grab it.
Yeah. Please do. I'm slowly getting through this book. I'm this one.
So this book, Black Sun by Nicholas Goodrick Clark, Aryan Cults, Esoteric Nazism, and the Politics of Identity.
Mm-hmm.
So you and I spoke on our last episode about my experiences with the woke right, encountering Stone Choir and another anti-Semitic, sort of podcast like that. And so it was actually this book that helped me understand what I had been mixed up in without knowing. So this book came providentially because I heard a YouTuber talking about it, actually. And so I picked it up and I started reading it, and I'm like, oh, that's what's going on. So this was God showing me, what I just delivered you from, you were mixed up in this. And so I talked about public repentance. That was part of it. So since then, and that was like August or July of 2024, for the past at this point, almost 2 years, this is the book that I've recommended more than any other for people to understand the woke right. It's dense, it's academic, it's published by New York University Press. I encourage people to read it so often that I finally decided, you know what, I'm just going to read it to you. And so in my book club on Substack, and many of these episodes are now on YouTube, I go through chapter by chapter and show the various dimensions, as the author did, of neo-Nazi thought in the post-war era. And so many of these aspects of neo-Nazi thinking are showing up in the public discussion today, but they aren't announcing what they are. People are used to thinking of neo-Nazis in terms of like skinheads and stuff like that, but that's not what it looks like anymore. And that draws from a much earlier tradition of post-war neo-Nazi thinkers that focused more on the mystical and the fantastical. Esoteric Hitlerism is what it's called. And so a lot of the anger that the skinhead kind of movement embodied has been stripped of its skinhead branding and placed on top of it the mystical, the theosophical, and repackaged via memes for an audience today. And this book was published in 2002, so before the internet era, and the author passed away, sadly, I believe in 2012. I wish I could speak with him, but he called it really early on. And so on my book club, I read books like this and work through them so people can see some of the streams that are feeding much thought today. I would also like to, in future episodes, get to, one second.
Sure.
This book, the Warrant for Genocide, The Myth of Jewish World Conspiracy, and the Protocols of the Elders of Zion.
Oh, interesting. Head on.
Yes.
Okay.
So this came out in 1967. This is a rare and out-of-print book. But in the author, Norman Cohn, breaks down the origins of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion in the first half of the book. And then the second half of the book, he talks about their impact. And so the Protocols purport to describe a myth of Jewish world domination. They were a fabrication produced in the late 18th century. Yeah, the late 18th century. Yeah, 19th century, 1800s. The late 1800s and the early 1900s. They were wildly popular. And it's from the Protocols of the Elders of Zion that the conspiracy world gets this idea of this Jewish world conspiracy. That's where that idea comes from. And it's essentially, it's endemic to the New Age world and the conspiracy world in general. It comes from the Protocols. This book is an overview of where the Protocols came from and then their ultimate impact, particularly in Germany, but also after. This is also a very dense and kind of scholarly book. If you're not into reading dense and scholarly books, I totally understand. I have just the book for you. This is the book, The Plot, The Secret Story of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion by Will Eisner. Will Eisner is a famous comic book artist, and so in this book, he tells the story of the protocols in comic book form. So if you want to understand where the protocols came from and their origins, and then a little bit about their impact, you can buy this book, The Plot. This book was written, I believe, in 2004, so it contains slightly updated historical information compared to 1967. But whereas this book will lay bare the origins of the protocols, and it's a comic book, it's very easy to read, it's fun to read too. Warrant for Genocide also talks about the impact. So between these two books, you can get a pretty good understanding of the protocols and the effect that they're having on people today, particularly in the conspiracy world. So I would like to get to Warrant for Genocide on my book club as well.
Yeah, because a lot of podcasters today, a lot of very popular influencers, very popular conservatives
Mm-hmm.
are echoing sentiments that are in that
Yes, they are.
in that whole, the protocols, the book.
Mm-hmm.
And would it be an overreach to say that it was that book that ultimately shaped Hitler's worldview on the Jews?
1,000%.
And would it be an overreach to say that because of that book, Hitler, that it basically played the biggest part in his worldview that shaped the Holocaust?
Yes, and he's not alone. So the protocols, the reason why the protocols are damnably effective is that they provide a worldview justification for morally horrendous acts. If you believe that there is this world conspiracy of a particular ethnic group against your particular ethnic group, if you believe that you are engaged in a war at that level, then you can do whatever you need to do in order to push back on that war. So the protocols was not just influential in Adolf Hitler. He actually mentions it in Mein Kampf. It was influential going forward in many thinkers, which we talk about in Black Sun. The protocols of the Elders of Zion shows up in literally every chapter of Black Sun, that someone, even educated people, read the protocols, believe it, and then shift their entire worldview around it as like, white men need to push back on the evil Jewish scourge. And it's the protocols that informs that worldview. And it gives license to people's conscience to do whatever they need to do because they're at war. We're at ethnic war. Therefore, everything is on the table to preserve my people. And that's the infernal power of the protocols, is to give men license to do terrible things because they believe that they're engaged in a war.
Sounds like to me like critical theory, right? Like this was the ideology behind a lot of assassination attempts. Charlie Kirk's murderer. I mean, it's like he's the bad guy that I got to take down, and by any means possible, because hate speech is as bad as violence. It's the same thing. It sounds exactly the same to me.
That's right. And so to go back to our conspiracy discussion, if you believe that you are subject, even if you strip away the ethnic aspect, if you believe that you are subject to a conspiracy against you from the highest levels, you then have license within your conscience to respond to that with all possible force. And this is why it drives people mad. This is why despair, it becomes overwhelming. You look at this force that's so much bigger than you, that has power over everything, and then it leads to despair, and despair is an intolerable state for many people to be in. So then people react with anger, and then the anger takes them over, and they begin destroying their lives, and they begin destroying their relationships because because they're now awake. They see the truth, and I need to impose the truth on you, or I need to wake you up to the truth, or I need to do whatever I need to do to fight back against this conspiracy. That's why that worldview, that mindset is so deeply destructive. It produces a disempowering feeling, which is intolerable. And so people respond with a form of empowerment that is ultimately destructive to their lives. And I believe that's the point of it.
That's why they call it a mind virus. So
that's right.
So interesting. Yeah. So guys, we're kind of on the tail end of this conversation, but if you want to pick up if you want to smell what we're stepping in here, check out the video on the woke right, because a lot of this will make sense. And it will kind of be the extension of not just Will's story, but what it is exactly, more of what we're talking about. So, Will, thank you so much for your time. I know it's really hard for you to do a short podcast.
Right.
So I really appreciate you being extensive, sharing so much. And guys, everything we talked about, be sure to check out the description. Will, again, I want to thank you so much for coming on my channel.
Thanks for having me, Melissa. This was great.